I am Tatiana, director of the Disruption Network Club, and I'm really happy to introduce to you our 15th conference, Dark Havens, Confronting Hidden Money and Power. And first of all, I would like to thank my wonderful team. First, Lieke Plucher, that from this year is with us the director of the Activation Community Program. So we have been already doing a great event with her. And I want to thank the wonderful team I work with, Daniela Silvestrin, Nada Baker, and Monty Harmony, the project managers of the Disruption Network Club, and James Franchi, the designer and strategist, and Joe Haveman, the PR manager. So thanks a lot to all of you. And to do a little intro about the Disruption Lab, we are working since 2014 to examine the intersection of and as I say, this is our 15th conference and is also starting the 2 years collaboration that we have together with Transparency International. And I really want to deeply thank them, especially Michael Hornsby, Max Haywood, and Maira Martini, because this collaboration has been so great for us so far and will be also later. And we have been also constructing this program together. There were a lot of sharing, of discussion. So thank you for you. Wonderful. So thank you, Transparency International. And also I want to thank our funders, the Hauptstadt Kulturfonds, that is the Capital Culture Fund of Berlin, the Riva and David Logan Foundation, the Checkpoint Charlie Foundation, and also the support of the Open Society Initiative for Europe within the Open Society Foundations. And we are also working in partnership with the Friedrich Stiftung. And our partner venues, the Kunstrankreuzberg Bethanien, the Supermarkt, where we will have our workshop on Sunday, and State Studios, where we are doing our community. And also our collaborating partners, the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet Society, and the Whistleblower Network e.V., and our communication partners in Werkstatt and Furterfield. And then, of course, I want to thank all our wonderful speakers that will be with us in the next 2 days and introduce a bit this conference. We are following the cases of the Panama Paper, the Bahamas leaks, and also the Paradise Papers. By investigating this kind of subjects, at the same time, we want to discuss the inner mechanism of the financial systems. And what we really want to point out, also for the history of the Disruption Network Club, is that these kind of topics are not just related to financial issues, to really technical subjects, but are also connected with other effects on society and politics and the everyday life of everybody, because as the whistleblower John Doe was saying, by speaking about tax havens, offshore systems, we are also speaking about social inequality and this kind of form of discrimination that are not only economically driven, but also are related to the way the society then is built up, and also the way inequality is formed. So in this 2-day conference, we want to discuss these topics. We have many international and local speakers that are joining us. At the same time, today we will show the German premiere of the Panama Papers, the documentary directed by Alex Winter. And on Sunday, we will have a workshop that is a psychogeography tour of the Berlin shell companies organized by the artist collective rybn.org. So now that we gave this introduction, I'm really happy to introduce the first panel. That's titled Hidden Treasures, how the global shadow economy drives inequality, so connected to the discourse I was doing before. So I'm happy to call on stage Nicola Shaxson, please come, and Maira Martini, and the panel is moderated by Simon Shuster. So I go here on the side. Thank you for being with us. And as we usually do, I like to introduce the moderator, Simon, and then he will introduce the speakers. Simon Schuster has been in Berlin since 6 years, you told me, more or less, and has been the Berlin bureau chief of Time magazine since 2013. Responsible for coverage of Central and Eastern Europe. He's born in Moscow and raised in San Francisco, and he has been working, focusing on the European refugee crisis, the rise of right-wing populism, and the Russian hybrid warfare. So thank you very much, and we will enjoy the panel together. Thank you.
Hi all, thank you all for coming. Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. So you were introduced our guest briefly, but I was given about 5 minutes or so to kind of introduce the topic. And I wanted to start with a reporting experience that I had on the subject of tax havens some years ago. It was about 2013. And one of the characters that I came across in a story I was working on was a guy named Peter Troost. He's from the small town of Skokie, Illinois, and his business for about 50 years was selling tombstones. So if you die, you can go see Peter Troost and he'll set you up with a nice stone. And he made, a few $1 million over the years in this business. And because he didn't want to pay taxes, he moved that money to a Swiss bank to hide it. In 2013, he is informed by the American justice system that he's being charged with tax evasion, very serious crime in the US and many places. And his prosecution was presented by the American government and the Department of Justice as kind of a success story as part of a much bigger crackdown on tax havens and tax avoidance. The Obama administration kind of made this a pillar of their time in office. Obama famously, touted this as a main issue in 2008 when he was on the campaign trail. He pointed out the Oogland House in, where was it, in the Caribbean, or where is it? Cayman Islands. And he said, there's 12,000 companies registered in this one house in the Cayman Islands. And he said that's either the biggest tax scam or the biggest house in the world. And indeed, when he came to power, there were some serious reforms. We got the what is it, Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, otherwise known as NAMBLA or FATCA, which is a serious piece of legislation. And I was reporting a lot on how the United States government under Obama was going after Swiss banks, in particularly for bank secrecy. And I happened to be at the headquarters of the Swiss Bankers Association when the Swiss government finally capitulated to American pressure and said, fine, we will open our secrecy up after decades and give you information about the clients of Swiss banks. And these guys in the Bankers Association that day were really in a panic, running around like their hair was on fire. And I talked to one executive there, and he said, if you've heard the news, that means the world has changed. Great quote, wrote it down in my notebook. But as the months went on, it was clear that the world hadn't really changed all that much. I then talked to a Caribbean banker, a Caribbean lawyer who works on tax issues, and I asked him, is it true? Has the world changed with FATCA, with a lot of the initiatives that the U.S. has implemented? And he said, not really. Well, the difference is that guys like Peter Troost, who's like, a millionaire, but maybe has a couple $1 million, he is now screwed because this very simple mechanisms for tax avoidance that he uses don't work anymore. But for the Caribbean lawyer, his prices and his clients are just fine, because for the more complex methods of tax avoidance that I think we're going to talk about a bit on this panel as well, those continued to survive and indeed thrive in the years since then. So I think more pressure came from things like the Panama Papers and the work that you guys do, rather than relying on governments to sort of police these ultra rich people. So with that, I want to turn it over to some specific cases that my colleagues here are going to talk about. Nicholas, I think you wanted to go first. So Nicholas, you were introduced. He's written a couple books on the subject, most recently The Finance Curse, which came out last year in the UK. And I'll turn it over to you to get us into the nitty-gritty of things. Thanks. Should you use this microphone, or it doesn't matter? Yes. This one.
Okay. Great, thanks for that introduction. So I'm going to start actually with a very broad overview. That's going to be my presentation today. I'm going to look at tax havens, the subject of my book, Treasure Islands, but also try and marry it with the ideas of my latest book, The Finance Curse, which is very complementary, and use this as a pointer towards how we can think about finding solutions for these gigantic problems that we're all grappling with here. A little bit of background. I am a journalist by background. I started in Angola back in the 90s during the war, trying to understand why such an oil-rich country was so poor. The war was one reason, but there were lots of other reasons. And just then, academics were putting together this concept called the resource curse, and we'll get into that, but I kind of stumbled, I kept bumping up against tax havens when I was in Angola. It was kind of the end of my investigations. And later, in the early 2000s or the mid-2000s, I started looking at tax havens, and I realized I had thought that my career was going to be looking at oil and politics in West Africa. There was quite enough there to be looking at. But when I met John Christensen, who was the main founder of the Tax Justice Network, he laid out the issue of global tax havens, which then everybody saw as a kind of exotic sideshow to the global economy. And I realized how huge this issue was and how interesting it was. I basically, from one day to the next, I flipped my career. I realized I couldn't leave this alone. I had to start looking at this. And that led to my book, Treasure Islands. So I am going to, as I said, talk very kind of broadly today as a sort of introduction to this, this event. And I'm just going to start by some very simple ideas, my own thoughts, the results of my thoughts of having worked on tax havens. What is a tax haven? There is no generally agreed definition of tax havens. There's a few technical definitions out there that focus on tax. But my definition, which I hope is one of the shortest definitions in the world, really boils down to two words. And those words are escape and elsewhere. In other words, you take your money somewhere else to escape whatever rules you don't like. Tax rules, financial regulation, whatever. So I take a very broad view of what offshore is. This broad view, once you start looking at the jurisdictions that are involved, you realize that what they're offering, tax is usually only one component of a whole range of facilities that they're offering. They're offering secrecy facilities. They are offering escape from certain laws that, and it's nearly always either wealthy individuals, super wealthy individuals in particular, and multinational enterprises that are the main users of tax havens. So they're able to get escape routes and impunity from democratic laws. Criminals, of course, I think that's the kind of has been until recently the popular perception of crime, of tax havens. It's all about crime. Monopolies is another interesting one. Market power. Tax havens, and we can discuss this in the questions if anybody's interested, are tremendous vehicles for increasing the power of already large and powerful corporations or even individuals. They're great mechanisms for controlling markets. This is all about rigging markets. It's about rigging the economic system, rigging the capitalist system against ordinary people in favor of a small number of people. So the theme of this talk focuses quite heavily on inequality. And all of the mechanisms I'm going to talk about really have an impact on inequality, political inequalities, economic inequalities, inequalities between countries, inequalities within countries, gender inequality, racial inequalities. All of these things are made worse by this phenomenon of offshore tax havens. The other thing that some people are confused about, not everything that happens in tax haven is illegal, of course, but a lot of stuff that gets called legal activity, that gets called tax avoidance, and if you look in the dictionary, the English dictionaries will say tax avoidance is legal by definition. Well, in fact, we can discuss this in the questions. A lot of what gets called tax avoidance, corporate tax avoidance, is not legal. So I'm a journalist, but I'm also a campaigner and activist. I believe my book, Treasure Islands, is a book with very strong opinions. I believe this stuff is, and I guess most people in this room would agree with me, this stuff is very, very bad for our societies, our economies. I like to steer clear of technical legal definitions about what's legal and what's not. If you start getting into that terrain, you get bogged down very quickly and lose your way. I like to focus on the political effects of this and the economic effects of this. This is engineering a gigantic transfer of wealth upwards from poorer sections of wealth and power from poorer sections of society up to richer sections. Another great theme that I have found in all tax havens, and particularly the smaller havens in this case, is what I call the captured state, where the offshore financial sector comes to dominate not only the entire political system, but it dominates, and the economic system as well, it tends to dominate the culture as well. So it's very, very difficult and painful for people in these places, particularly the small places, to oppose the system. I spoke to someone in Liechtenstein who had made some complaints about the offshore system there, and she said that her sister now crossed the street rather than walk past her because she had gone so far beyond the pale. She had questioned the cultural values of these places. And they all have this kind of self-belief: we are clean, we are well-regulated, we are responsible, we are international financial centers, we're not tax havens. You'll hear this from all of them. So this is what I call, it's a version of the captured state, but the capture in these small havens is really absolute and really strong. So tax havens also are suffused with these offshore ideologies where the offshore interest, the interest of the offshore financial sector, is equated with the national interest. So what supports finance must be good for the country. It turns out that if you go to the Cayman Islands, for example, trillions of dollars wheeling in and through the Cayman Islands, the beneficiaries of that are largely white, male, probably middle-aged and older expatriate players who are temporary residents there. There are some benefits that flow to the local population, but the actual benefits that flow to the populations, even of these very small places where you can have huge amounts of money coming in and potentially being spread among a very small population, even in these places, the actual benefits are pretty limited. And I will argue later that in other countries, particularly larger countries that have a very strong financial model like the UK, this sector has been very, very harmful to the country as a whole. You see all this money coming in, but it actually isn't helping the country, and in fact, it's worse than that, it's damaging the country. So this is another great theme of tax havens, the theme of freedom. These are places that are offering escape. Excuse me. Sorry. These are places that are offering escape routes from rules and laws, things that rich people and multinationals and criminals and all sorts of different people, what they don't like, they want to escape. Freedom is what they want. And freedom is often taken to be a good thing. But of course, if you start thinking about freedom, you want to ask who is calling for this freedom and what's their interest. So I put a kind of slightly frivolous cartoon up here. This is the freedom of the tax haven. It's the freedom of the fox outside the hen house saying, freedom for the chickens. You always want to be careful when people start wielding this argument. So there's a great libertarian streak to the tax havens, which is a cover for something much nastier. Now there's also a paradox at the heart of tax havens. When I wrote Treasure Islands, and particularly the Swiss chapter, I was always interested, and it was always the first question I would ask people. How do you square the fact that Switzerland and Swiss people are widely regarded as among the world's most trustworthy, most punctual, most honest, cleanest streets, all these fantastic, wonderful things, and at the same time Switzerland is arguably the biggest or one of the biggest dirty money laundering centers historically? Well, there's no coincidence actually that you have this clean and dirty going on, because you have a tax haven wants to be seen as clean. It wants to be seen as trustworthy because it wants to attract your money. They don't want you. Nobody's going to send their money to a banana republic. Nobody's going to send, you can think about it this way. How many Swiss people will have their money in Nigeria, and how many Nigerians are going to have their money in Switzerland? This is a one-way flow out of poor countries, unstable countries, into rich countries. So the cleanliness, the trustworthiness is very important. Britain is another example of this. On the other hand, these places want as much dirty money as they can because it's profitable. So you have the incentives to be clean and the incentives to go for the dirty stuff. How do you square that circle? Well, there's a number of ways, but for me, the sort of central offering of these offshore tax havens is, you can trust us not to steal your money, but we will turn a blind eye if you want to steal someone else's. We'll take your dirty money. And it has been a very successful strategy for many of these people operating these tax havens. And there are other mechanisms they use to square that circle, and of course, spin, and we are not a tax haven, we are clean, we are well regulated, is the other standard thing that we see again and again and again. So this is just my kind of conceptual beginning for how to think about what tax havens are. They're escape routes, and there's kind of, a geography going on. In Treasure Islands, I kind of describe 5 main groupings. There is, in my view, the biggest, or one of the biggest, is the British network. And that constitutes of London itself, the City of London itself, and the United Kingdom, and Scotland as well. I think some of the people in this room will have investigated Scottish structures that have been used to commit some awful crimes. But also the British satellites, the overseas territories and crown dependencies in particular, Jersey, Guernsey, the Isle of Man, the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Gibraltar. All of these places are like satellites of the City of London. And they're used to, how am I doing for time, by the way? How much time have I got left? Okay. Am I okay? Oh, watching you. Okay. I've got plenty to go. So there's a kind of group of European tax havens, Luxembourg, Switzerland is a gigantic tax haven. So the FATCA program that you were talking about was all about Americans finding out about American taxpayers cheating Americans. Sorry? Oh, sorry. So it's kind of the American cleanup, crackdown with FATCA is kind of like a one-way flow. America finding out information. But if somebody else wants to put their money in the United States and hide from their tax authorities, that's a completely different matter. America is not going to be sharing that information in general terms with that country, particularly if it's a poorer country. And that has been a deliberate strategy. There's some very interesting documents that I've seen since this. We want to be the new Switzerland. There's a fast-growing Asian network, and there's a few kind of oddballs like Bahamas, Panama, Dubai, which aren't particularly connected to any of these powerful countries, and they tend to be kind of down market places because they don't have this sort of bedrock of being either a rich country or supported by a rich country, so they don't have that same element of sort of trustworthiness, so they have to go for a different market, and that's kind of, you know, shadier stuff. How big is the system? There's a lot of stuff being written about this. There are two main estimates out there. One is from Gabriel Zuckman, a French economist based in the US, I think, 7.5 trillion. There's James Henry, who did an estimate for the Tax Justice Network and updated it since they're closer to 40 trillion. I think Henry's is the better estimate, and we can discuss that in the questions if anybody wants to know more about that. Another way of looking at it is how much tax is being lost worldwide as a result of corporate tax avoidance. And sorry, I didn't put that in. This is corporate tax avoidance. 600 billion a year. That's just corporations using tax havens to avoid tax. Okay, I think time is probably running a bit short, but very quickly, this is an ecosystem, different places offering different facilities. So the Netherlands, for example, is all about corporate tax avoidance. Ireland is about corporate tax avoidance plus dodgy financial regulation. Switzerland has an even broader offering. London, even broader, kind of all singing, all dancing haven that offers any kind of offshore service you want, whether in London or in one of its satellites, et cetera, et cetera. This slide I think I will skip over. I think most people in this room are familiar with some of the features of tax havens. There are many different mechanisms. This one is perhaps a little bit more unexpected. I take the view that, and in both Treasure Islands and the Finance Curse, I looked at this in some depth. Offshore, being about escape, one of the biggest elements of this whole system involves financial stability, involves offering facilities to escape financial regulation. Wall Street, London have had this kind of dance where Wall Street wanted to get out of very onerous financial regulations that were underpinning some very high economic growth at the time until about the 70s. And they used London as their escape route. They were able, it's a kind of like offshore playground for financial regulation. And in the Finance Curse, I kind of trace how London played not a tangential role, but an absolutely central role in creating the global financial crisis. Most people see it as an American phenomenon that kind of spilled out around the world. But this actually was a very different thing. London was absolutely central as an offshore playground, degrading American regulations and offering this escape route at the same time. And I also argue that London, this financial regulatory escape route was the flip side of London's role as arguably the world's foremost dirty money hub. It's the same mentality, the same people, the same kind of competitiveness or ideology. We must be competitive. We must attract this hot money by degrading our regulations. It's part of the whole British philosophy. I'm going to skip over this. Anybody can have a copy of this presentation later if they want. But at the end of the day, all of these things, all of these different dimensions of offshore, the crime, the financial regulation, the tax, the secrecy, all of these things generate inequality, political inequality and economic inequality. And all of these things, by their very nature, undermine democracy. Escape routes, these are escape routes from the rules of society, from democracy. And they are creating one set of rules for the winners, large multinationals, banks, hedge funds, wealthy individuals, and another set of rules for the rest of us. And that is about as damaging to democracy as you can get. And it is a systemic global phenomenon. So with that background on tax havens, I now want to bring the Finance Curse concept in here. I think that we need to consider new ways of fighting this phenomenon. I think most people in this room probably have some interest in or involvement with trying to fight against all this terrible stuff that we're seeing spewing out of tax havens or spewing into tax havens. I think we need to start by thinking about what power is, why it is so difficult to shut these places down. Why are they so difficult to tackle? Well, I like this quote from Lee Shepard, who's one of the US top tax experts. And she had an article, why don't we shut down these financial whorehouses, as she called them? We don't shut them down because the town fathers are in there with their pants around their ankles. In other words, the people who are making our policies, who are in charge, who are running our countries, are the ones who are using this system. And that's just as true of rich countries as it is of poor countries. It's more the case in Britain, where these phenomena are central to the whole elite establishment, than it is in Germany. But Angola, they're all using tax havens as well. So it's very difficult to design strategies to tackle this stuff. Another way of thinking about this, excuse me. So going back to your example of the US Department of Justice going after in the Obama administration, going after Swiss banking crimes. Well, the Swiss media generally portray this as a battle of America versus Switzerland, a battle of big bully versus small, plucky, brave Switzerland. And it was a very successful way of getting the Swiss to stand together. The Department of Justice knew this, and they took a different approach. They went for the bankers, because a much better way to understand this phenomenon is not country versus tax haven, not America versus Switzerland. This is a global battle of a criminalized billionaire class against democracy, against ordinary people. So you need to conceptualize the geography of offshore correctly. This is not country versus country. You need to think this much more in political and economic terms on a global level to understand what's going on. So if we're thinking about Africa, this is not Africa versus the West, so much as transnational networks of plunder that include African dictators, but also accounting firms, banks, private equity firms, using techniques to suck money out of Africa, versus broad African populations. This is the same battlefield that we ordinary people are fighting on as well. We have a shared agenda with African populations. So if we want to start thinking about how to tackle the looting of Africa, one of the best ways is to realize that this is not a question of altruism. We in the West need to sort of, give money to Africa, help Africa, because it's very difficult to generate coalitions for this kind of change. You get some NGOs interested, but you won't get people out in the streets with placards in large numbers, in their millions, protesting about this stuff. But if you can show that we have the same agenda, we have a shared agenda against these transnational networks of plunder that are harming all of us, then you can really start. Once you can persuade people that this stuff is harming our own countries, that people in the powerful countries in the West, that this stuff is harming, then I think you can start really thinking about proper change. So this is where my concept of the finance curse comes in. Money is flowing out of Africa, being looted and flowing out of Africa. That's obviously harming populations in Africa and in many other countries. But the problem with tackling is that people in the West see this money coming in. In the UK, we see this money coming in, plenty coming into Germany as well. And it's kind of like, well, we don't like what's happening in Africa, but we like the money, it's good for us, so let's, it's a difficult message, very difficult message to sell. And for me, this is the big confusion, because if we can show, and we can show, that these inflows are harming our own economies, it's not just Africa being harmed by the outflows, we in the West are being harmed by the inflows, then I think we really have the potential for a proper, solid, big political platform for change that can really make a difference. I'm afraid, given the time constraints, that I won't have time to go into how this all works, the finance curse. I've got 1 more minute. But basically, okay, I will just sum it up in a nutshell. The finance curse is a phenomenon which is now being studied by economists. It is like the resource curse in Africa. All this money pouring into countries like Angola seems not only not to have made Angolans richer, it seems to have made them even poorer. And there's a lot of academic research on this. it is also the case that there's a new load of research from the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, and others showing that countries that have too much finance, where their financial sectors are too big, too bloated, start to suffer lower economic growth than countries that have a financial sector that's more suited to the demands of to the needs of its real economy. And this graph I've got here is kind of like, it's a graph of financial development versus economic growth. We all need finance to start off with. We all need it to, pay our bills and stuff. But once your financial sector reaches an optimal size, it shouldn't grow any further. Once it grows bigger than that, then growth starts to suffer. And a whole range of other damages, ranges of dimensions of damage hit your country. And this is an exciting new area of research. Once we understand that this stuff is bad for us, here's another dimension of damage. Donald Trump, he's very much a creature of capital flight after his big bankruptcies. He kind of recovered, particularly through getting capital flight out of all sorts of countries, Russia and elsewhere. The Elf Affair is another fascinating one. I guess some of you in this room will be familiar with the Elf Affair, the wholesale corruption of the entire French political establishment through this kind of offshore networks linked to African oil. The endless corrosion of British politics, which if you read Private Eye magazine, you will be very familiar with, by offshore interests. All of this stuff, that's just another dimension of the damage that is coming from all this finance. So for me, that is the way forward, is to show people in the West that this stuff is bad for us too. This dirty money coming in from elsewhere, it's not only harming the countries it's being stolen from, it's hurting our own economies too, in so many different ways. And I can only, do a bit of self-promotion here. Read The Finance Curse to find out more about this. But I do think this is a very important way of thinking about how to tackle this stuff. Okay, thank you very much.
And with that, no further introductions needed, really, but Maira Martini is with Transparency International, as she was introduced before, and particularly an expert in how banks are used in corruption schemes, and I think that's some of what she's going to talk about. So, Maira, over to you.
Can I use this microphone? Yes. Is it on? Yeah, you can hear me. Hi, everyone. I don't think. This is dangerous. Yeah? Okay, good. 1 second, that my pen. I guess I don't need my pen now. That's fine. So, hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I want to talk to you a bit about the role of banks in corruption case. I can perhaps do this, yeah. And hopefully I'll pick on some of the things that Nicholas just mentioned. But first, let me introduce to you quickly to Transparency International. That's where I work. So we are a global movement, and we are present in more than 100 countries. You can see there in blue where we are. And we fight corruption. In the times we are living now, and I'm from Brazil, so I speak from experience, I think it's always useful to remind ourselves that fighting corruption is not an end in itself. So actually what we're fighting for is for a more equal and just society. So just to keep that in mind, once once anti-corruption becomes also the populist and the right-wing way of campaigning. So our chapters work a lot at the national level. So they have quite great achievements in the last 25 years in fighting corruption at the national level. But it didn't take so long for us to realize that if we really wanted to make a difference, we would need to look beyond one's borders. Corruption is transnational and need a broader approach if we really want to deal with it. So Nicholas was talking a bit about the role of tax havens and so on. And in corruption is exactly like this. The corrupt needs a place to hide illicit assets and illicit gains. No one wants to steal money and keep it under the mattress at home, right? You need to be able to take it somewhere where you can spend. And that's where secretive jurisdictions or tax havens, how you want to call it, become very, very attractive. And we have seen that one way of doing it, and there have been quite a lot of studies that show that majority of grand corruption cases actually rely on the secrecy and anonymity. So what they need is a company where they don't need to register their name, and they can use this company then to do business in many places. And the problem is that it's very easy to get a company without having to register your own name. It's what we call shell companies if they don't have any other purpose. And there are many secrecy jurisdictions that offer this very easily. So there is a study that was published last week by a partner organization in the US, the Global Financial Integrity, and they actually showed, there has been a saying going around for really long that it's easier in the US to open a company than get a library card. So they just went and tested that. And they analyzed all this in all states in the US, and they actually showed that. So all the green there is what you need to get a library card. So you need to give your name, you need to prove your identity, and in red is what you need to, or what you don't need to open a company in the US. So that's why, for a while now, center in our work of Transparency International has been calling for more transparency in in corporations. What we call beneficial ownership transparency is a very boring term, but it only means to really know who are the real people behind companies. But what we also have realized when Panama Papers showed this and many other scandals showed this, is that it's not sufficient to have just a company, right? You need to have a bank account connected to it. If you don't have a bank account, it becomes very difficult to actually move money and spend your money. And it's true the banks are seen as gatekeepers, particularly in developed countries. They're really seen as gatekeepers of the financial sector, and because of this, they have obligations. And according to international money laundering standards, they have many things that they have to do. I listed here like the three main things I think banks need to do on a daily engagement with customers. The first of it being they need to understand the ownership structure of their corporate clients, including identifying the real people behind those. They have to have adequate mechanisms to deal with high-risk customers, and here I mentioned politically exposed persons that are those who have high-level positions in their countries. And they need to submit suspicious activities reports to authorities, that is, communicating authorities that might be something wrong with that transaction so authorities can do something and continue investigate. Danske Bank, Deutsche Bank are just two examples that have been in the media now that show that actually banks are not doing the street things that they should be doing. And today we are at TI now, we are conducting a study that looks at 50 cross-border corruption cases and trying to understand better how banks are being used and if and why they have been failing to do their jobs, right? The study is not finalized. Probably you can hear more and see it in September when we launch. But today I wanted to bring one case that we are analyzing as part of this larger study that I think it helps to illustrate a bit what is happening and how banks has been used. So it looks complicated. It's not complicated. It's actually a very simple money laundering scheme. And there were two main banks that were involved in this scheme. They were both in Switzerland, and I promised that this was not agreed, that we were all going to pick on Switzerland. It's just a coincidence. This larger scheme, this is just a small part of a larger scheme that took place in Brazil called Car Wash, Lava Jato. Many of you might know. And the broader scheme in Brazil essentially worked like this. You had politicians that would nominate or indicate people to for high-level positions Petrobras. Petrobras is a Brazilian state-owned company in the oil sector. These people would negotiate public contracts with construction companies. They would get bribes in exchange for that. They would part of the bribe would also go to the politicians that nominate them in the first place. So that was the essence of the scheme, and they have done this in all different sectors where Petrobras operate. So this story I will tell, and bear with me, I know there will be a lot of names. It's just one of little small part of this scheme. So it always started with Petrobras in 2009. The company, one of the managers of the company, this Pedro Bastos, was approached by a company in Benin. This company in Benin got a concession for exploiting oil in Benin and approached Petrobras, offering Petrobras to buy 50% of these shares. Internally, there was a discussion. They decided it was not a good deal. Apparently, the manager didn't accept a no as an answer and continued negotiating with this company in Benin. In 2011, the deal came true, and Petrobras bought 50% of this oil rights. It turned out that Petrobras paid this company in Benin 34.5 million. You can see there in the beginning of the infographic. And immediately in the same day, this company in Benin sent the money to another company called Lusitania Petroleum, that is actually the mother company. The Benin company is just a subsidiary. And this Lusitania Petroleum is a BVI company, an offshore, never had anything to do with oil in its history, didn't have any assets. So it's a bit of a mystery how this company got the concession in the first place. So if any journalists in the room want to look into that, that's probably something fishy. So Lusitania Petroleum was owned just by a Portuguese businessman. The next day, Lusitania Petroleum sends part of this money, so there were 3 different installments, were sent to another offshore company. They all had accounts with BSIs in Switzerland, called Acona. Acona was I will stop here and talk a bit about how this company was formed. So Acona is formed in the Seychelles. Upon the request of this guy that you can see up there next to BSI's name, David, who was a vice president for Latin America of BSI, he requested Mossack Fonseca, the one of Panama Papers, to open this Acona in the Seychelles. After this, he opened an account with BSI, and this company received part of the money, right? The beneficial owner of the company was just some random person, an intermediary. No one knew what this person had to do with this. So here we can see, this is the request from David to open an account, a company named Acona. Those are all the other companies that he asked Mossack Fonseca also to open. So for journalists in the room, one more tip, probably something wrong there. So like Lusitania then first transferred 10 million to Acona, and then their subsequent transfer in the following years. The bank did find something was wrong and asked the first 10 million and asked the manager of the account, David, for more information. And here you can see that his explanation was, and I will quote him, external consultant for Petrobras for international service / questions, intermediary between Petrobras and Lusitania Petroleum. So you have 10 million being transferred, that is like 1/3 of the whole amount paid by Petrobras for intermediary service, but this apparently was sufficient and the transaction could move on. There was a second transaction that also raised suspicions. You can see there, the compliance system of the bank said, well, there is a risk of money laundering there. Still, he says, see the proof in email attached, blah, blah. And if you go to the email that was attached, unfortunately, I don't have it here. He says, I had phone conversations with the parties, all fine, period. Move on, you can continue. So that's how you had in the end more than half of the total amount that was paid by Petrobras end up in an offshore account owned by a random guy that no one knows who he is. And this Acona was kind of center, because from Acona, the money continued moving in different directions. And I'll talk a bit about the next account that got money also with BSI, that is the Sandfield. Same process. Sandfield was created just 1 month before Petrobras signed the agreement in Benin, also by the manager of BSI, who requested that now a company is open in Panama. So Mossack Fonseca was the one who opened the company, and he registered the company and opened an account with BSI. And surprise, surprise, the beneficial owner of the account is Pedro Bastos, the same Pedro Bastos who negotiated on behalf of Petrobras the purchase of the oil field. So it's not a very difficult thing to do, right? The money left Petrobras, passed through 2 offshore companies, and reached the third one that actually the beneficiary is a manager of Petrobras. So I would say something is weird. But the bank apparently didn't think it's weird. And actually he gave, there was in the files of the account, there was a visit card, his Petrobras visit card. So it was filed there. So they knew pretty well who he was. And from between 2011 and 2013, Pedro was using this account for many things. He was receiving money, he was buying jewelries everywhere. And funny enough, there is actually a payment to a customs office in the airport of Rio de Janeiro, where probably he just wanted to be able to come in with all the goodies he purchased somewhere else without having to answer any questions. So now let's very quickly, I will move just to the other part of the scheme that involves a politician in Brazil, and he was the one who actually appointed Pedro for his position. This time is another Swiss bank that was involved, is Julius Baer, used to be Merrill Lynch in Switzerland. And the money also started to be moved from this Acona account. You have 1.5 million that goes to trust from Scotland, as you mentioned, called Orion with Julius Baer. And this trust existed already for a while before this transaction happened. So you can see this is the account of the trust, and you can see that there was money flowing already in 2008, so before this scheme happened. And the beneficiary of this trust is called Eduardo Cunha. He, at the time, was the Speaker of the House in the Brazilian Congress, a quite important politician. He kind of was the one behind the former President's Dilma impeachment and led it through. So he was the beneficiary of the account. He's in jail now in Brazil and being prosecuted in 6 different scandals, which might explain a bit of the transactions prior to 2011. And I think what is also interesting to see here, you can see, for example, there is 264,000 that goes to Posada y Vecino Consultores. This is just a corporate service provider from Uruguay who was helping him to set up different trusts and open different bank accounts with this bank in Switzerland. And they received quite a lot of money. Look, they appeared there 3 times, 250, 260,000 dollars. And the money stayed in this account. When the money arrived from Acona in this account, it stayed there for like 3 years. Only in 2014, when the first director of Petrobras was arrested as part of the car wash investigations, he moved the money to another account. And that is this Triumph account that is an offshore company that was established, created in Singapore. And he's also the beneficiary. He was a bit smarter, so he had a trust, then he had another trust, and he had an offshore company in Singapore, and the money was moving from in these accounts. Finally, and he was the beneficiary of all these accounts. There are bank documents that show that his name is there. they actually did their jobs. They found out he's a PEP, so they say yes. It comes from a high-risk country, yes. They tick the box, but no problem. That's perfectly fine. He can move all this money. And by the way, in 2014, where all these transactions were taking place, his tax declaration to Brazilian authority, it was saying that his income was $100,000 per year. So yeah, there is something wrong. And then finally, let me show just this. You can see that most of the money ended up in this account that calls COPEC. That was also an offshore company, and the beneficial owner of this account is Claudia Cruz, who is Cunha's wife. And this account, there were documents in the bank that show actually saying that this account is connected to a trust, and it's basically just to pay credit card bills. And they say here, it's bad to read, but they're saying that no one should worry that Eduardo Cunha, her husband, has gone through thorough due diligence twice. So everything is good, you can continue. And this account was then used to purchase several things. They were going on real shopping sprees to like Miami, New York, Paris, and Rome, and visiting all the very expensive places. It's in Portuguese, but you can see the names of the brands and the amounts they were spending in different places between 2014 and 2015, 2013 and 2015. There is one, I think, when they went in the beginning of 2013, they spent 9 days in Miami, and they were staying in a hotel, and for nine nights in this hotel, they spent $25,000, which is 4 times Cunha's salary. Was 4 times Cunha's salary as a congressman in Brazil. And during these 9 days, their credit card bill was close to $50,000. So I think this shows a bit that the banks did part of their jobs. They actually identified all the beneficial owners behind those companies, and they actually knew quite well why the transactions were happening, but they failed to report. And you saw that the compliance system often found also that something is wrong with these transactions, but were just told by the management to proceed regardless. And I think it shows a bit to us that something is wrong, right? There needs to be better supervision in place. That it cannot be that the bank can run an account such like this one between 2008 and 2016 without raising any questions. And you mentioned a bit that we have been relying on the work of whistleblowers, journalists, and civil society organizations to bring these cases to light. And I think it's time that authorities take this back to themselves and also do their jobs. We can't continue relying only on others to do their jobs for them.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Lots of fascinating detail in there, and I know from experience that it's often hard to present the complexity of tax schemes like this to readers, to listeners, to my editors, because the complexity is the point, right? In a lot of ways. I mean, these schemes are designed to be so complex that journalists and bankers, investigators just get tired of trying to sift through to the beneficial owner, to the person who is behind the schemes, who actually owns the money. So you did a very good job of cutting through the complexity. So we have about 10 minutes of discussion here, and then I'll turn it over. I don't want to. I want to get to your questions as soon as possible. So just a kind of broad one for both of you guys. For me, what do you see as the weak spot in this system? You know, in the tax haven system that we're talking about. What is the way to attack it? Is there one kind of silver bullet or hole we can plug that would really help address the problems we've been discussing?
Okay. There's obviously no silver bullet that will kill the system. There'll always be tax havens. I would say there are two main things that are required. One is on the technical level. I think we need to think about, rather than going after, well, we need to go after all of them. But if we're going to focus our attentions, go after the banks and the financial sector, the private intermediaries, because that's where it's all happening. That's generally the successful way to go after these things. The other thing is, at the end of the day, this is all about politics. It's about political change. We had a global financial crisis that could have been a gigantic opportunity for reform here. When it hit, the analysis wasn't out there. People were kind of laboring under this idea that this system was somehow benign or small or not that important. And the crisis hit, and we couldn't harness. There was no analysis, no real analysis. There was some stuff that, excuse me, the Tax Justice Network was just starting to put together some kind of systemic analysis, but it was still in its infancy. So that opportunity was lost, and I think, opportunities for reform, at the end of the day, crisis is kind of required to get real change. I think we're now in a slow burn crisis that is going on. It's a different kind of crisis, not a sharp shock, but it's a rise of what some people call populism. I hate the term because populism kind of equates left and right, and it also suggests that what's popular is wrong. And I think the crisis and subsequent events showed us that it's the experts who got it wrong, and maybe the people had it right all along. But I think that we do need. So this kind of slow burn crisis that's going on is building up momentum. And you spoke about the difficulties of telling these complex stories, people's eyes glaze over. And it's something that's always worried me. Is this just a flash in the pan? I remember when I was writing Treasure Islands, there was some tax haven scandal that came out. I can't remember what it was, actually. But my agent sort of called me and said, could you just quickly hurry your book out because, now's the time. We won't get another moment like this. And I sort of, I just can't, and I sort of waited, and then Treasure Islands came out and got a lot of attention, and it was the global financial crisis, I think, which really lit the fire for people being willing to listen to this stuff. The old system is discredited, and here's a different kind of analysis. So I think right now, Trump administration's in power. Not much prospect for reform in the United States, a multipolar world emerging with China and other countries becoming relatively more powerful that don't have necessarily interests of our democracies close to their hearts. So it's a difficult situation, but I think there are people who are saying there could be another gigantic, sharp crisis around the corner. If you look at the financial system, all sorts of risks are building up. So we should be ready for something sharp to come along, something disruptive and unexpected to come along, and really use that as an opportunity to, because that's when you can really push for change. Yeah.
A lot of as you said, a lot of the points that I mentioned at the top, FATCA, the Obama administration's attention to this, that was pushed by the global financial crisis, right? And it pushed them to do something. It was on the agenda, but they clearly didn't go far enough or to the top of the system. Maira, would you have some ideas on how to kill the beast?
No, I think, as we were saying, a lot of this is driving because of secrecy. So I think transparency is always the best solution. So that's why we have been insisting and repeatedly saying that we need more transparency and we need to know who are the people behind this. And it should be much more difficult for those wanting to hide. And I think it should be the exception, right? Like, why do you need an offshore company in the middle of this such a simple transaction, like a two-way transaction? Why do you need to put 5 offshore companies in the middle? So I think it should be, people should start to have, I don't know, to prove that there is a reason for that offshore company to exist. And more transparency, for me, is the only solution.
Another question I'd have, I always think back to the Swiss banker who told me, the world has changed, and then I realized it didn't. I had that feeling again that maybe the world of, at least of tax havens, has changed when these big leaks come out, you know, Panama Papers and so on. What's been your experience, you know, it's 3 years now, we're 3 years out from Panama Papers, that has been the impact of that? You know, what's changed in terms of public perception and in terms of policy that you've seen, if anything? Well,
I can start. I think there is significant change, at least at the EU level. I think the anti-money laundering directives, and we had actually a directive short time of period after one was adopted. We had already had another one that goes way further on talking about transparency. So I think there are positive policy changes that were certainly driven by Panama Papers and other scandals that came through.
I think quite a lot has changed. I mean, on a personal level, when Treasure Islands came out, there were a lot of people saying, "Oh, he's exaggerating. It's not really as bad as this." And then Panama Papers came out, and like, okay, yeah, it is kind of like that. I think what's been happening is that the offshore system, and again, I'm being very broad here, talking about the secrecy stuff and all the stuff that you've been talking about, but also this broader system involving corporate tax avoidance and, you know, financial regulation and so on. It develops, it progresses, it grows as a result of these kind of competitive dynamics. One jurisdiction puts in place a very clever new secrecy law, money flocks there. Other jurisdictions, advised by their accountants and lawyers and bankers, hey, that jurisdiction's got this secrecy law, why don't you go one better and do something even more secret and even more devious here? So they put that in place. And you get this kind of race to the bottom. And this is a kind of generic dynamic that is expanding the system, pushing it forwards, and also pushing it into our supposedly onshore economies. Because our own, you know, the UK, I'm British, we're always saying we must be competitive in this area, the City of London must be competitive. So we must degrade our regulations a little bit more because Hong Kong's going to race ahead of us. So not only is the system expanding, it's, you know, onshore is becoming more offshore, we're all becoming more tax haven-like. So you have all this force pushing in one direction. Before the global financial crisis, there was nothing really pushing in the other direction. This system was just growing under its own steam, under this kind of free market ideology of let it all happen, let the financial sector rip, and it'll generate prosperity and stuff. Now, after the global financial crisis, that complacency, that ideology has been shattered, and ordinary people in Britain, not so much in Germany, but in Britain, you get people, you know, I hear people talking in pubs about tax dodging and tax havens and stuff like that. It's a popular subject now. It depends on the country. But this kind of pressure is now rising from the streets in the other direction. Voters are noticing it, and governments, therefore, are noticing it. So they're pushing in the other direction. What's the result of these two opposing forces? Well, the result at the moment is a mess. So you have the OECD, a club of rich countries, is putting together some initiatives. The Common Reporting Standard is, in many ways, a very impressive improvement on how things were before. It is trying to create transparency, trying to get information shared around the world. It's also full of loopholes and lots of people lobbying to water it down, and countries aren't implementing it properly and all sorts of stuff. So there's this kind of complexity and mess emerging. On the corporate tax avoidance, there's another thing called BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting, which is kind of the corporate, multinational corporation version of this same thing. But in that case, we're getting to a stage now where the international tax system for multinationals is kind of beginning to fall apart. There's a recognition, explicit recognition by the IMF just in the last few weeks, and also recognition by the OECD and by others that this system ain't working and we need fundamental reform. But that's not what we're here to talk about. But the general phenomenon is you have these two opposing forces, and it all depends on political will and voters, and we'll see where it goes. But there have been some improvements, and you know, things could have been an awful lot worse.
Well, I mean, just a quick comment, and then we'll turn it over to questions. You know, as those two opposing forces kind of meet each other head on, you know, the pressure to change the system and the growing complexity of it, what I've seen is an even greater stratification of the very richest levels who can afford the complexity. The complexity costs money. It costs money to shift to new jurisdictions. It costs money to build these architectures of shell companies and so on. So the very richest still do fine. They're still protected by their ability to hire these armies of lawyers, right? And the pressure to change kind of nips away at the lower level tax avoiders you know, who are still in many cases breaking the law and do deserve to be punished, but still isn't causing systematic change. So that's just something I've observed while reporting on this. And with that, I really want to hear what issues you guys are interested in and what questions you have. We have 2 microphones that should be circulating around. So yeah, please, right there in the middle.
2 short questions for Nicholas. What is your take on Brexit from a tax haven perspective? Like, do you think that the EU tightening anti-money laundering regulation had played any role in, I don't know, deciding to get out of the EU? And second short question, you didn't have Austria and Germany in the European tax havens. Why that?
Okay, I'll answer the second one first because it's much easier. Yes, I should have actually put Germany in there. I don't know why I didn't. Germany definitely should be in there. There's a book called Steueroase Deutschland by Markus Mainzer, which looks at this, how Germany, and if you look at the financial secrecy index of the Tax Justice Network, Germany is, I think, number 7, if I'm right, something like that, very high up. One of those unrecognized tax havens. In other words, money is coming from other countries into Germany, going into German real estate and all sorts of other assets, and Germany is not sharing that information with the governments of the people who, the rich people who are putting their money in Germany. So yes, I should have, and thank you for correcting me on that. And Austria as well. Austria for me is, indeed it is, it has been a tax haven. It's one of the smaller ones. I find Luxembourg annoys me a lot more. That's why it was in there. But you're quite right. I could have included Monaco, Liechtenstein, you know, some Andorra, some of these. I mean, Austria is bigger than that. Now, Brexit. I hate that question because it's so complicated. There is basically, in the Conservative Party in the UK, there are kind of 2 factions. There's a pro-European faction and there's an anti-European faction. And the anti-European faction has got a lot of the individuals involved had got a lot of question marks over their own finances, and they have got all sorts of financial investments. It's not something I have followed in detail, so I can't give you any details about that. But there is a lot of what I would call offshore money in the Brexit movement, and in UKIP, the party that was very instrumental in bringing this issue up. So yes, offshore finance, and this would be an example of the damage that I was talking about, these inflows coming in, this connection with the offshore system. You know, the Conservative Party treasurer was big names in Belize, which is a very, Michael Ashcroft, a very big tax haven. All these characters across large parts of the Conservative Party, but also parts of at least the historic Labour Party before Jeremy Corbyn. Quite a lot of offshore interest there. It is the British establishment. So there has been quite an offshore involvement in Brexit. How that has worked, I have not followed in detail. The other thing is, there is a faction that talks about what they call Singapore on the Thames. And what that model is, it's basically, if we go for Brexit, we can then be like Singapore. We can then be an offshore tax haven. We'll be free to do what we want. We can degrade our laws. We can be more secretive. The EU won't stop us anymore from doing all this stuff. And we'll be rich. And it's kind of one of those things they say, and a number of people believe it, and it's a persuasive argument for a significant section of the British population. So yeah, that's a kind of rambling answer, but it's a very difficult question, but offshore certainly has got something to do with Brexit. Also, the Brexit vote was 52 to 48. You could say a lot of issues swung the vote because it was so close. Tax havens certainly swung the vote, not only for these reasons, but also because there is now a widespread understanding in Britain of how the elites are getting away with not paying taxes, with the laws falling away and everybody else having to do what they want. And they understand, it's very widely understood in Britain now how important tax havens are in corrupting the entire British establishment. And this anger, which is also related to inequality and poverty and deprivation and all these terrible things that are happening in Britain, this anger was a massive contributor to the Leave campaign. So for sure, you know, if that anger hadn't been there because of the offshore system, then, you know, in another world, it wouldn't have, you know, it would have swung the other way. So, yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a vague answer.
To help you avoid self-promotion, just a point about your book. I mean, that argument that the money's flowing in, if we become a tax haven, the money's going to flow in and we're all going to get rich, that has a very powerful effect on voters. It's easy for politicians to say, if we pass these laws, these secrecy laws, the money's going to flow in, the banks are going to grow, and we're all going to get rich. Your book, you know, I think in a groundbreaking way, points out that no, the systems that develop and the way the economy changes when this type of money, this type of finance flows in, is very problematic and in many ways damaging to the economy itself. Maira, did you want to add something, or next question? Yeah, please. Yes, the gentleman there in the middle.
If I may broaden it just a little bit to the political question that Nicholas brought up a couple of times, we've seen over years the reaction against the lobbying of the bankers, the derivatives dealers, swap dealers, huge sums of money that go in to stop any kind of change. And I think that's one of the things that's led to what some people deride as populism. But the people across Europe and the United States are angry at the fact that people who have money are able to change the laws and to use that to evade taxes, to launder money. Just one quick example in the US, 2 people who were involved in covering up money laundering were James Comey, who was on the board of Hong Kong Shanghai Bank and then became FBI director, Mr. Straight Arrow, and Robert Mueller, who as FBI director, covered up the BCCI scandal. So I'd just like you to address a little bit how you take on this, the flows of money that end up corrupting the politics.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. There's another interesting angle to the BCCI scandal is something that it kind of exploded in the 1990s. This was a very British scandal, which involved what, for my money, is probably the rottenest bank in world history. Maybe not. Maybe there's even worse banks than BCCI. But another little interesting snippet of that is that there was a plan hatched by Margaret Thatcher's advisors in the early 1990s to make her president of BCCI when she stepped down. I only found out that recently. So, yeah, this bank, this rotten bank, kind of totally infected the British establishment and the US establishment as well. But in this case, it was generally the US prosecutors that went after this British bank. And that's a long-standing pattern. There is almost no prosecution of British bankers by the British authorities in the last few decades. If you see British banks being prosecuted, it's by the US authorities. Even though US prosecutions of the banking sector has been thoroughly degraded during the Obama administration and before and since. But Britain really is a particularly rotten player in this game.
Maira, you mentioned an example of essentially politicians moving between political posts and bank posts as bank executives. I mean, can you address?
I think
that
there was
problem?
I think there are a couple of examples in the US, but elsewhere that shows like the problem of lobbying in enforcement. So there was recently this Swedbank case, that is this Sweden bank that is involved in a huge money laundering scheme. There is also clear connections between people in the board of this bank and the supervisory authorities in Sweden that shows like how close to power these banks are. And in the case I presented, actually, like the BSI and Julius Baer, they were never punished. There's all this information. David, this manager from BSI, was arrested in Brazil. He's in jail in Brazil. And still, the FINMA in Switzerland, the supervisory authority responsible for financial institutions, didn't give any sort of punishment to any of these banks. So I think there is the industry is really powerful. In the US, there are other examples that goes beyond banks. So hedge funds and private equities in the US, they don't have any money laundering obligation. So basically, they can get all the investment they want from whoever they want. They don't have any obligation to know who are the people behind the money that they are getting. And that's perfectly fine. real estate agents in the US. Since 2001, I think it's 2001 if I'm not mistaken, there is an exception to the Patriot rules in the Patriot Act in the US that says real estate agents are exempt from these rules for a while. This has been 20 years and they're still exempt from these rules. So I think it shows how powerful lobbying of certain corporations and professionals are, and the impact it has on policy and on enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, one policy idea to address some of the points you raised could be some kind of moratorium, right? So that there can be a revolving door directly from a senior political post, like, I don't know, FBI director, directly to the executive suite of a major bank that was previously, that might be a pipe dream, but that is a policy decision that governments could make. That there would be at least a 3-year legal period or something like that where politicians or regulators couldn't go work for a bank. But that could also just be a band-aid that wouldn't really address the problem. So it's a tough one. Any other questions? In the back was the first hand that went up there, the gentleman sitting by the camera.
Hi, thanks for your takes on these topics. I wanted to know, it's very admirable the work you do and the work your collaborators do. You're not doing this alone. I'm just curious to know what are the personal costs attached to the work you're doing, because obviously you're stepping on certain people's toes.
Maybe my wife would be best to address that, how little she's sitting in the audience there. But yes, loss of sleep, maybe headaches from trying to explain what tax havens are. Yeah, but please.
From my perspective, because I spend more time interested in the kind of systemic aspects, I mean, I do, investigate certain things, but my analyses generally use these to illustrate things, but are not the primary purpose of what I'm doing. So I generally haven't had problems with that. I've had bits and pieces of slightly menacing stuff happening, in Angola and places like that, but nothing too bad. I think it's people like, OCCRP, Offshore Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, who really go and investigate, gangsters and stuff like that. Those are the people who are really at the sharp end. And some journalists are investigating a particular story. But yeah, so from my perspective, it hasn't been. I was worried about it when Treasure Islands came out because I knew I was taking on a whole system, and I was also expecting, because I was always wondering why has nobody reported on this before? It's not like the information is locked away. You can find it. It's hard to find, but you can find it and you can put it together. Why has nobody put this analysis together? And I was kind of wondering maybe I've misunderstood something or got it all wrong or something. And I was expecting, when it was published, to be a whole chorus of like, you're an idiot and this is just insane and possibly something more menacing than that. But when it came out, I was confronted with silence, and that has generally been the response to what I published. Not attacking me back. There was one guy in the Cayman Islands, chairman of the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority called Anthony Travers, who jumped up and down saying Shaxson is an imbecile, doesn't know what he's talking about. Never with any specifics, always just he's an imbecile. But apart from him, there really wasn't much. And I think, in many cases, these people just kind of shrink away and either they know they're doing something wrong or they don't want to listen to, people who they regard as, leftists or whatever, and they just dismiss it, and they've got the money and the power, and they can sit in their little bubbles and talk among themselves and carry on their happy life drinking champagne. But as I said, there are other people who are at a much sharper investigative place than I am.
Yeah, I guess similar for me. I think what we face sometimes is more the legal aspect of it, the harassment, right? So we're often harassed by governments or companies that don't like what we're saying, but physical threats, it's not something we face with the type of work we do. But I think tomorrow you're going to listen more from people who actually have first-hand experience with dealing more with investigations and the risks that incur also.
Can I just add, yes, the point about libel is very important. That is, for people like me, libel is a huge headache. You can get sued in London and for really quite trivial things, and you have to nail things down very, very carefully, and you can get into terrible trouble if, get tied up and lose lots of money personally. So that's, for me, has been the biggest threat.
Yeah, one point from the journalistic side. I mean, you brought up this point about the boring term of beneficial ownership transparency. I mean, what that means is exposing the money of someone who doesn't want it to be exposed. And when journalists do this, from my experience working in Russia and Ukraine, that is the most dangerous type of work. It's not, people often ask me like, oh, how do you write these things about Putin, you know, aren't you scared? You know, criticizing politicians, even in places like Russia, generally is okay. Exposing how someone makes money in a way that they don't want exposed is extremely dangerous. And you know, this happened to me. There was once a story I worked on, it's like 2010 maybe, where it was an arms dealer who was shipping arms, it's an amazing story, from North Korea to Iran, like the most sanctions isolated, locked up countries he was shipping. And he was a Russian gentleman from Kazakhstan. And because of my article, he wound up in a UN list of sanctioned or designated individuals. And yeah, he sent guys around to the office to try to, I guess, beat me up. Luckily, I wasn't around at the time and I had to leave the country. So these things happen. Like when you hone in on that beneficial owner behind these networks of companies, that's the most dangerous work that journalists can do. And I think, I commend the folks at OCCRP, especially who we're going to hear from a bit later for doing that kind of work. Do we have time for one more question?
And the whistleblower, isn't it? Let's not forget the
yes,
whistleblowers.
the whistleblowers, especially, yeah, when they come forward. Yeah. Time for one more question, please? All right. Yes. Waiting patiently. Thank you.
No, it actually touches my question on what you just said. It seems to me that the dark havens, the tax shelters, all of this is just the tip of the iceberg, and the way to put money into an incredibly large shadow banking system that's financing huge amounts of operations and illegal drug running, weapons systems, and transnational operations, military operations that are in the interests of various parties, and going all the way to the Vatican, which is financing things all over. So really, just the dark havens are just the way to put money into that system. But the system itself shadows the dark havens, the sheltering by far. I mean, that's just a tip of the iceberg, really, of the shadow banking system, what you're talking about.
I think the broader system couldn't work without it, right? I mean, would you agree, Nick?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it depends what you mean by the shadow banking system. I mean, there's certain sort of players that are recognized as in financial regulatory circles anyway, as shadow banking players, hedge funds, and so on. Is that what you're talking about?
I mean, once the money is in the system, okay, and there's trillions, there's even estimates that it's bigger than our transparent system. It's financing huge operations, huge purchases of weapons, huge purchases of drugs, the whole movement all the way back from the 50s, in Cuba, and all of this was huge amounts of money. Patricia Goldstone speaks about it in Interlock. Mark Lombardi, an artist, did diagrams of it. I mean, it's talked about really in circles. Of course, you gave an example. When you really go into it, your life becomes threatened. When you go into a specific deal that's financed by this shadow banking operation, then your life becomes threatened. And because as long as it's not talked about and it's not out there, and the dark havens are, a lot of the people who are sheltering money are not a part of this system. They're just like executives that want to illegally shelter money and not pay taxes and whatever. But this whole system of the dark havens is just the tip of the iceberg of something that has trillions behind it, and that's used also transnational political things like CIA has alternative operations that are illegal that are all funded through this system.
Well, I would kind of disagree with your characterization of that, actually. I think that there is this misunderstanding that the tax havens, the offshore system of tax havens, is some sort of exotic sideshow to something much bigger. No, I would argue that tax havens are right at the heart of the global economy and the financial globalization that's been going on, particularly since the 1970s. So this system is absolutely central to what's going on, I think. But you're right that all sorts of operations that we see are routed through. Every multinational in the world has lots of subsidiaries in tax havens. But it is absolutely central to everything that's happening in the financial system, the global financial system.
No, just maybe to say, I agree with you, and I think the only similarity is that perhaps the same mechanisms are used by different groups, so armed trafficking, drug trafficking, human trafficking, they all use the same mechanisms that are in the offshore center, so I think that's it, yeah.
Yeah, and just to add, kind of obvious point, that it would be a lot more difficult for the more it would be a lot more difficult for them to operate as freely as they do today if they didn't have the ability to use the offshore banking system to hide their profits, to move money around, to make payments, and so on. So I think that's a really important thing that as a journalist I try to get across whenever, and I'm sure you do too, Nick, you do as well, that we're not just talking about businessmen and corporations hiding their money. We are talking about the more kind of violent and dangerous phenomena in our societies are fueled by couldn't way without them.
No, I mean any criminal organization, say it's in the United States, for example, if it was not able to use offshore tax havens, if it was having to do everything through US domestic bank accounts, if they were bottled up at home, the forces of law and order would have an awful lot easier job going after them.
I think we have to end it there. I just end by plugging a report that Maira has coming out. You innocently didn't mention it. Maybe September, but look out for it. It's coming from Transparency International. It's in the works. Thank you all very much. You've been a great audience. And I'll hand it over to Tatiana. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's been really a great start of our conference. Thanks to all of you. I just want to say that now we have a 15 minutes break, and then to come back we will have the panel leaking massive data sets. So we also enter into the deep of the data there, and after this panel we will have the screening of the film The Panama Papers. So please come back in 15 minutes. I would say we can start in 2 minutes as soon as the people find a seat. And I could start introducing this panel. I'm really happy to be the moderator, actually, because I'm personally really interested in what they're going to say. And here at the Disruption Network Lab, we have been really caring a lot about data, and we want to know more about that. So I think that here at the panel, we have really the perfect people that can illuminate us. And so, as I say, the panel is called Leaking Massive Data Sets, Security, Openness, and Collective Mobilization. And I have here with me Friedrich Lindenberg, that is the data team lead from OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And then on the right, Ryan Gallagher, that is investigative reporter and editor at the Intercept. And what we want to discuss here is, from one side, the ethic of massive data leaks. That is a subject that concerns with the discourse of security and secrecy versus openness and transparency. So one question that would come in mind is who controls the data, who accesses the data. At the same time, we mentioned the discourse of security, so the analysis of the strategies of indexing data, and at the same time, also the discourse of source protection and privacy of data. And finally, the discourse of transparency that we already touched upon in the panel before. So the question related to open investigations, but also the discourse of collective mobilization that is something really important to analyze. And in this specific subject, I mean, many of you probably know the story of the Panama Papers. Was a huge, massive amount of data that was leaked in 2015, was 11.5 million financial and legal records that came from the Panama-based law firm Mossack Fonseca. Then the following one was the Bahama leaks, that was in September 2016, and we are speaking about 1.3 million companies registered files. And the Paradise Paper, November 2017, a set of 13.4 million leaked confidential electronic documents about offshore investments. So in a sense, you know, speaking about these data leaks, we have a problem of a huge amount of data that has been, that needs to be analyzed. And the question is how? For example, for the Panama Papers, we will discuss this tomorrow. The Süddeutsche Zeitung reporter Friedrich Obermeier and Bastian Obermeier decide to contact the International Consortium of Investigative Journalism to analyze this data. But of course, there could be also other possibilities. And in a sense, the discussion that we want to have here today is related to what is the right and ethical choice of analyzing massive leaks, and also how can we guarantee source and privacy data protection, and also in which way it is possible to engage the people and also create collective mobilization, because when we speak about such huge amount of data, it's also really difficult to share them. So I want to start by introducing our great speakers that know much more than me about this. So I stop speaking here. We start with Ryan, that is an investigative journalist and editor for the Intercept. And his work focuses on the intersection between national security, technology, and human rights. And he was previously a contributing writer for Slate. And his work has been appearing in The Guardian, Financial Times, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Independent, Art Technica, the Huffington Post, and New Statement, among others, a lot of them. And then Friedrich, here, Lindenberg, leads the data team at the OCCRP, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, as I say. And is responsible for the development of the OCCRP data and supports ongoing investigation where data analysis is needed. And he was before a Knight International Journalism Fellow, and also previously a Knight Mozilla Open New Fellow at the Spiegel Online in Hamburg. Before that, yes, there is still something important. He was an open data activist that worked to promote the release of government information about public finance, lobbying, and also lawmaking across the world. So the activist part was important, I mean. Yes, so let's start right now with Ryan, and then Friedrich will present afterward. If each presentation is something like 25 minutes, so just to let you know, and then we will have a little debate and we open to the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana, for the introduction. Yeah, so as Tatiana mentioned, I'm, for those of you who don't know me or the work that I do, I'm an investigative reporter and editor with a US news website called The Intercept, and some of the big sort of leaks or document dumps that I've been involved in reporting in recent years have been, one that I'm sure most of you will be familiar with is the Snowden documents, which I was involved in reporting for a few years with The Intercept and a whole range of other news organizations. We also published a few years ago a series called The Drone Papers, which was a leak of documents about the US government's secret drone warfare program. It's the only leak of its kind that's actually come out about the US drone program still to this day. And more recently, I've been working on a series of stories about Google in the United States and its attempt to build a censored search engine for China, and we had a whistleblower who disclosed documents to us about that, and it's been an ongoing series of stories now for about 8 months or so, and it's still sort of rumbling on. So that's my background. But today I'm gonna talk kind of generally about what it's like in journalism to be involved in reporting on big leaks of information, big disclosures of documents, what it's like to work with whistleblowers. I think that, you know, generally speaking, when we do these stories, there's a lot of noise around that happens and there's a lot of headlines, but people often, I think it's kind of opaque, the work that we do behind the scenes, and people are often, I think, don't really understand some of the discussions that go on before actually you get to the point of hitting the publish button on the story. So I wanted to, for the benefit of hopefully many of you who are not actually involved in working in the media here, to just give a bit of an insight and maybe provide some context to some of the discussions that are going to be going on around, for example, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers that we'll get into, I think, in the question and answer session and in the film later on and all that. So first of all, I wanted to give a bit of history and a bit more context to all of this stuff, because we often just exist in a kind of present day bubble, it feels like, and we're focusing on the here and now. But what's really interesting to me is looking back, you know, just a few decades to the big leaks of past years, past generations. So I picked out a couple of those, some of the more famous ones out of the US, which is the Pentagon Papers and the COINTELPRO leaks. Now, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with certainly the Pentagon Papers, which was a disclosure of documents about the Vietnam War and the US government's lies to the public about the Vietnam War, and a whistleblower came forward in the early 70s and actually disclosed what was 7,000 pages of documents, which at the time was absolutely a massive amount of information to be passed to journalists. Caused a massive scandal in the United States and really shaped the course of the Vietnam War, and probably contributed heavily to its end because it stirred up huge opposition to the war. The COINTELPRO leaks was a case actually where a bunch of activists broke into FBI offices and stole about 1,000 pages of documents revealing FBI domestic surveillance activities in a program called COINTELPRO, which had involved targeting civil rights activists and people like, including Martin Luther King, through the period of massive protests in the United States, and also they were targeting anti-Vietnam protesters, even some lawmakers in the US. Again, triggered a huge scandal, but it's only 1,000 pages of documents. The present day, if you just look, the graph is illustrating quite starkly, I think, some of the more recent ones we're familiar with, the Cablegate, the WikiLeaks disclosure of US diplomatic cables, Iraq war logs, again, WikiLeaks, Snowden disclosures, the recent WikiLeaks disclosure of a whole range of CIA internal documents. These are all in the hundreds of thousands. So you're going in a space of a few decades from a massive leak being considered about 7,000 pages to hundreds of thousands, and then, of course, some of the even more recent ones, and the ones that are focus of a lot of discussions today and tomorrow at this conference, the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, you're into, you know, more than 11 million, more than 13 million documents. So the trajectory of what we're dealing with in journalism is really extraordinary, just in terms of scale. With the Pentagon Papers in the early 70s, what Ellsberg, the leaker, he actually was doing, it's a fascinating story, is that each day he was working for a contractor, a government contractor called the Rand Corporation, and it had a copy of this secret Pentagon Papers study. And he decided to disclose it, but to do that, every day he was going into his office and he was smuggling out a small amount of the papers, so just enough that he could stash in his briefcase. And he would leave the building that day, and he would then go in the evening and make copies of those documents using a Xerox machine. And it took him something like three months, it was several months, till he was able to actually make the copies. And at one point, he even roped in his family to help him to copy the documents. He had his young children who were like 10 years old at the time, helping him to photocopy these documents, which when you think about it, is just extraordinary. But this is the process that he had to go through. And I've used this old picture of an example of a room filled with pages to make an illustration. That's the kind of process that Ellsberg was going through in the early 70s. Now, when you consider the process present day for a whistleblower or a leaker, one of these little things, I mean, you could probably get 100, 200, 300, 400 rooms like this stacked full of pages of documents, compressed and digitized and stored in one of these. That has had such a profound impact. I think we take it for granted sometimes just because we're used to it now, but it's had such a profound impact on, obviously, society, but obviously for the purposes of this, I'm talking about journalism, because what it means is that whistleblowers today, they are now in a position to, they don't have to do the process Ellsberg went through. They don't have to spend 4 months smuggling out documents to copy them. They can copy and paste thousands upon thousands of documents onto one of these tiny little SD cards, and obviously that's easier to smuggle out than you know, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents on this. It's easy, it's trivial to get that out of a building for, in most cases, except in extreme high security circumstances. And of course, this for journalists, this is creating new problems, new challenges, because when Ellsberg was doing his leaks, and also like the COINTELPRO case with 1,000 pages of documents, the reporters who are getting those documents, they're having to sit and manually read every single page, you know, go through it one by one, highlight it, pull out extracts, contextualize it. It's such a laborious and long process to do that, to just manually have to read thousands of documents. So there is just no chance at all that you're going to be able to do that when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands or even millions, tens of millions of documents. It just isn't possible. So when it comes to some whistleblower or leaker provides a reporter with this information on one of these SD cards or however they've provided it to you, the process, I wanted to just give a bit of insight into the kind of general step-by-step process that you would go through. First of all, I'll probably put them in the wrong order here, because the first one really would be securing the data. What you want to be doing is, and how I work, and how we've worked on a lot of the big projects I've been involved with, is we actually just completely segregate the information from the internet. We will buy new computers that have never connected to the internet, and we will use those to analyze the data. And to analyze the data, I've put processing the data here. We use forensic software programs, such as there's one called Intella that I've used in the past, which is actually more commonly used, quite ironically, to a certain extent, by the police and intelligence services to basically mine through documents. When you get one of these SD cards, or someone's provided hundreds of thousands of documents, you're dealing with, sometimes it's just like raw files that you can't even open with any normal software application. So you have to actually get an index and all that. If you have image files, it can be spreadsheets, it can be Word documents, it can be PDFs, it can be JPEG files of scanned documents, it can be, photographs, it can be just all manner of things. So you want to use something that indexes it all, and you can then type in a keyword, or you can search for a phrase, and the software will do the hard work for you, because it just mines through the documents, identifies the things that might be interesting to you, that might be potentially newsworthy. But before you get to that point, of course, you have to verify the information. You can, unfortunately, get people who will try to furnish journalists with fake or forged documents in order to try and discredit a particular reporter or a news organization by having them publish what would then be subsequently proven to be fake. So there's a long process of verification you have to go through, which involves the kind of conventional going out and speaking to sources, getting second opinions, and it usually quite soon becomes clear whether what you're dealing with is real or not. But there's obviously a lot of ethical issues raised by dealing with large documents sets, and chief among them, if you're provided one of these archives, you're asking, well, you want to know who is it that's given me this, because it's not always immediately clear to you. The person could be a hacker, they have penetrated a government, or they have penetrated a corporation and actually stolen those documents for, they may have a particular political agenda. It may even be a former employee who is disgruntled and they've targeted their former employer. It could even be a spy, as we've seen in the case with the US election in 2016, the role of the Russian state in the Clinton email hacks and circulating emails in order to create a sort of chaos in the US election cycle, or of course it can be a whistleblower, and that would usually be the case you would prefer to work with as a whistleblower. There's less baggage associated usually with that, and the person is acting out of principle because they've probably identified some kind of wrongdoing which they believe should be publicly exposed. But another big issue for us is that it's not always possible to name the source. Even if you know the person's name, even if you've verified who they are, you've checked even their employment history, you know exactly who this person is, they might not want to be named because, of course, naming a person can put them at great risk. They can lose their job, they could be put in jail, they could be even assassinated or murdered, or it depends on how extreme you go on the spectrum and who you're dealing with. So there are all kinds of issues around naming a source. In the Snowden case, he wanted to go public, just like Daniel Ellsberg in the 70s, because he thought it was in public motivations of the person behind the disclosure, and he wanted to put his face to it and come forward and explain. But not everyone's in a position to be able to do that, and so some people don't. And also, you know, sometimes the case that you will never learn the identity. Even the reporters will not know who the person is, because you'll be provided documents which you can verify, but you can't be sure who is the person who's given it. And that was the case actually for a period of time through the Clinton and the Democratic Party email hacks. It wasn't 100% clear relation. character was, who in one case was involved in providing reporters with hacked emails, and it turned out that was evidently a cutout for the Russian state. It wasn't clear though who really that person was, even though it was obviously a sketchy individual. And going down the list of other issues you would be facing, redaction and publication of source material. This is always the hardest part, actually, when it gets to the stage of thinking about actually publishing the stories, because there's usually a lot of arguments and discussions around what you could be dealing with cases of victims of sexual assault who are exposed in certain documents. You could have informants to the government who are like operating in a country like the Middle East, who, if their identity was known, they would be undoubtedly just killed. So you can have serious cases, or in the case of the Snowden leaks, examples of undercover operatives or undercover assets in areas where there's conflict going on, and exposure of those could cause risk to life. So there's always a lot of discussions around that, and generally what the sort of rule we have is if there's a small risk of harm to a person, well then you err on the side of caution and you will redact that. But there's a broad spectrum of opinion in this area, and of course, on the more radical side of it, you have an organization like WikiLeaks, which is sort of vehemently against redaction as a principle and will publish large sets of documents without redacting, and more a moderate perspective, which would be most news organizations, which would try to do more curated publication of documents and redact in order to try to limit the potential harms to people who are named in those documents. I'll move forward. So I've touched on this a bit, but the risks, there's a lot of risks involved. First of all, I mentioned the ease of copying and transmitting large sets of documents to reporters because of the digitization of documents. That is in principle easy. And it's easy to just copy documents onto the storage device. The problem is now that obviously governments and corporations are becoming wise to that, and they have been for many years, and they are installing what they call insider threat programs on their computer systems. And these programs, for those of you who have not heard of them before, they basically, it's almost like a kind of corporate or government malware. It's logging all employee activity on the computer. So every time you plug in a USB or a SD card into your computer, it's getting logged on a central system. And every time you print a document, it's getting logged on a central system. Every time you type a certain thing, all your key log will be getting recorded. They can even be taking screenshots of your actual computer without you knowing that it's actually actively happening. So that creates a massive risk, because to the source, they can be quite easily identified. If there's suddenly a leak of information from a company or a government agency, they can sort of go back in time and they can say, well, who has accessed that document? Who has printed that document? What date did they do that? They can then check your emails, on your employee email account, see if you've had contact with reporters, or, sometimes sources make these mistakes. People aren't always savvy with security, so they will make mistakes, and this is why we have what's called the first contact problem. Sometimes the key communication in any relationship with a whistleblower or a source is that first contact, the first email, the first text message, the first phone call. Because if that person has not taken the precautions for that first phone call or text message, whatever it is, there's a permanent record that they've contacted you. They've contacted a reporter. And if down the line, after that first contact, you as a reporter try to get the person to take more precautions, you will meet them in person, you will make sure they're encrypting and using anonymity tools to protect themselves. It doesn't matter, because the first contact is still there. There's a permanent record of it. And so that's a big problem that we face, and this is one of the big risks in terms of whistleblowers being exposed and have been caught. We also have probably quite obvious risks where cyber attack, which is just the potential for being hacked by an adversary, especially when you're dealing with classified government documents. Every spy agency in the world wants to know wants a copy of those documents. They want to try and hack you. So this is why, as I mentioned before, we try to work in an environment that's disconnected completely from the internet. With legal attack, you can have threats of libel action. Corporations can try to shut down your reporting using, I'm based in England, and there's very bad libel laws for journalists there, and people can shut your reporting down just by accusing you of libel. Even if it's bullshit, they can use the legal mechanism to cripple a news organization because the finances involved in fighting the libel action are just like debilitating, and they know that. And so the rich, a lot of the big companies, especially like actually in the finance world, they are expert at doing this. And of course, physical attacks. Sadly, we've had many cases, more and more of them, unfortunately, especially in Eastern Europe, and of course in Malta and Russia, of reporters being assassinated, and also there's great risk to sources in all parts of the world of some kind of physical retribution. We worked on a story last year, I think it was, involving a defector from the Assad regime who was exposing the assassination of the journalist Marie Colvin. The risk of assassination for that person is just, I mean, it's immediate if that person is exposed. So there are quite scary at times risks, and I'm always amazed at the courage of the people who come forward, because they really take extraordinary risks to themselves to bring information out to the public, and we're always very grateful to them for that. Just finally, I'm going to try and wrap this up. The defenses to some of these attacks that I'm describing and some of the problems that we face, one of the best ones is to build partnerships. In reporting, there's a terrible culture of being quite competitive, and so one news organization is always trying to scoop the other news organization. And this is very toxic, I think, because what's far more powerful and what's far better, especially when you're dealing with big document leaks, is to collaborate together. Because not only then are you having a bigger impact in terms of you're reaching a larger audience, obviously, because if I'm reporting out of the US and we're working with Spiegel in Germany and Le Monde in France and Volkskrant in Netherlands all at the same time, you have a massive, you're reaching more people, and that's ultimately you want to get the information out to as much people as you can. But more so than that, you're creating a firewall against attack, because there's no single point that you can be sort of snuffed out. They can't silence you with some bullshit legal case. They can't try and hack your computer in some way and shut you down. In the UK during the Snowden leaks, the British government threatened to injunct to the Guardian newspaper and stop the reporting using a sort of ancient legal mechanism, which it could have done legally. And the Guardian then moved its operations to the US and started working with the New York Times and others to evade that threat. So working together in partnership is a very, very good way to ensure that the reporting can continue to happen even under threat from governments, and because you're operating in multiple jurisdictions at one time. Also, though, pooling resources, because the resources that newsrooms have are limited, and so to be able to pool your resources together is a very valuable thing journalistically. You also learn from other reporters professionally. I mean, I've worked with reporters all across Europe and almost in every continent now, in Japan, and I've learned so much just from working with colleagues and in other countries. So it's just a better way of working. And finally, another key defense and another thing that going forward we're always looking for and that we always want to sort of help to support is the development of new tools for journalists to collaborate and to communicate in secure ways. We have a system, and many news organizations now have it called a secure drop, which is a means to for a whistleblower to leak information, avoiding the sort of first contact problem that I described, because it uses a combination of an anonymity internet browser called Tor and PGP encryption, and the combination of these things is really the best defense that we have electronically against state surveillance of our sources. But we're always looking to work with technologists, software developers, and who have new ideas for how we can better collaborate. And I think we always have to constantly evolve in this area, because, like I said at the start, there's so many challenges when it comes to working with, when you're dealing with millions of documents. We really rely on technology to help us do things in a more efficient way. And I think that the more that we can collaborate, not just as journalists, but as technologists, software developers, archivists, data engineers, whatever your profession, everyone really has something to bring to the table. And I believe very strongly that the more that we can collaborate together, the better, more powerful a job that we can do, the more efficient we can do journalism, and it helps us to bring the stories out and to get the information out to the public in the best way, and the fastest and most efficient way possible, which is probably a goal that we would all support. So thank you very much, that's all.
Thank you very much. I think this applause should also go to the people that really risk a lot for bringing the truth out, as you also say. And now I give the word to Friedrich for his presentation. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, hi everybody. So I've already been introduced. I'm working for the OCCRP, and yeah, I don't have a fantastic bar chart, but I have a GIF. Everything is leaking, right? So you've shown the growth over the last 30. Oh.
He's coming.
Ah, maybe there's going to be a GIF. I promise you a GIF. But we've seen this development not only over the last 30, 40 years, but also, I've got a GIF now, it's amazing. But also really within, I think, even the last 3 or 4 years, right? I think kind of WikiLeaks and then the Panama Papers, it's really created a narrative that many people who are in positions where they're seeing wrongdoing are embracing, to say, okay, yeah, we need to bring this to light. And also I think there's like an odd sweet spot that we've achieved between like how good we are at doing information security and how many secrets there are still in the world. And somehow this is kind of working a little bit in our favor right now, where the people who have really interesting secrets, like the offshore industry, are not actually yet that good at keeping them secret. And however that happens, that's definitely in our interest. Obviously, there's a massive downside to that as well. But really what that means for journalism, yeah, it needs to develop on steroids, right? We need to look at our industry, and we need to look at basically how we can kind of develop both how we work as a social construct, how we work as a practice, and also what kind of tools we have, and you just spoke about this. But before I go more into that, maybe a quick word about OCCRP. It's already been mentioned very kindly before, but basically what it is a network of investigative outlets. Our traditional focus is in Central and Eastern Europe. We have 35 member centers, most of whom are in, basically they're small, 4 or 7 investigative journalists, non-profit centers in Central and Eastern European countries. We now also have a team working in South Africa and in Colombia, and so slowly it's expanding. Overall, I think at the moment we're kind of the largest investigative organization in the world, which is kind of odd. But the idea is really that if you are doing investigations, right, and you're looking into tobacco smuggling in Serbia, and you're looking into tobacco or another type of crime in Romania, really it turns out that what you're doing is you're not working on 2 separate stories. More often than not, you're kind of pulling at 2 different ends of the same kind of tapestry, because more than journalism, more than politics, crime definitely has become a globalized business, in part and in a very large part due to this kind of offshore financial system. And in part also, I think, because people were just real visionaries in designing how they could use the arbitrage between different legal systems, different kind of legal regimes, to A, steal money, and B, then make it disappear, right? So what we're working on is really kind of grand corruption. We're working on cases where there's been large-scale kind of theft. Often enough, you've got these like, I'm a very innocent German dude, right? And I come there and I think it's all so cliche, right? It's right out of Hollywood. You've got the daughter of the autocrat who takes a $2 billion bribe to let the telco company come into her father's country, right? You've got all these kind of very cliche stories. You've got this entire country that's run by 4 or 5 families, and then the president, if he wants to stay in power, has to marry the daughter of the most important oligarch, and their daughters then obviously in turn buy massive properties in London, because that's where you want to go if your own country is kind of in a weird place. And so it's very kind of interesting to see that this actual kind of vaguely James Bond-ish world actually exists and is kind of thriving in 2019. And so, yeah, our focus has really been to uncover these cases where kleptocracies have established themselves, have taken entire governments into their control, and are now squeezing it forever is in there, right? Whether it's kind of taking the last of money out of the railway system, out of the extractive sector, out of the healthcare system, out of whatever industry or kind of sector of society there is that money can still be taken from. Banking sector was mentioned a few times and is obviously a good place to find money. And so, yeah, we're trying to bring together these teams across different countries. And I think it's very much inspired by the work that, to some extent, even WikiLeaks started, but that was then also kind of moved forward by ICIJ, and that kind of OCCRP has been kind of ramping up for the past 10 years in terms of bringing together teams from different countries, teams from countries where the money is being taken, but also teams from countries where the money is then being deposited in safety, in relative safety, right? And leaks have played a massive role in this. This is kind of 2 years worth of basically reporting that we've been working on that is, if not driven by leaks, then at least heavily enabled by leaked information. And at this point, it's really a thing where if there's like 2 or 3 weeks where we don't receive some kind of large document dump of some shape or form, it's a real surprise to me. And the other thing, like basically there's been narratives in this. We've worked a little bit on the Daphne project, which was dedicated to Daphne Caruana Galizia. I also think I should mention her son here, Matthew Caruana Galizia, who's basically been doing all the engineering for ICIJ on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, and his family had to pay a massive price for that. And yeah, since then, one of the themes in our reporting at OCCRP has been, in particular, kind of this theme of the laundromat, right? So these are basically what the gentleman may have meant when he talked about shadow banking systems. Basically, systems that allow people to take money out of countries, mostly in Central and Eastern Europe, and then move them through European banks that appear to be complicit in this. Danske Bank is probably the most prominent example of this, but also Swedbank has been mentioned. And then basically bring them into whatever use is intended for them, whether it's stowing it away somewhere on a Cyprus bank account, whether it's bringing it into real estate, or whether it is to kind of use it on luxury goods and other kind of immediate kind of use. And yeah, it's interesting for me to see the extent to which basically, apparently, sometime in the early 2000s, you could just walk into the right office in Moscow. You could say, hey, I have $100 million that I do not want to talk about, and can you make them show up in Germany, right? Can you make them show up in Berlin? I'd like to buy some property on Kurfürstendamm. the fact that this has kind of been almost productized as a service industry that kind of runs on top of the traditional banking system, but somehow fully exploits it in a way that makes it inconceivable that there's not awareness of this, has really kind of shocked me. So at the beginning of the last month in March, we released a news story called The Troika Laundromat, which details one of these enterprises. And luckily, sometimes these things have an impact. This is the stock price of the Austrian Raiffeisen Bank. And I encourage you to find the point where we published the story about money laundering, when there was 12% gone. So it's kind of nice to see that sometimes that we actually have an impact with this, and that basically there is an audience that is listening to this, both within kind of the compliance industry, which is a very odd place, but also within legal and political authorities, prosecutors. I think U.S. courts were mentioned. I'm always stunned by how much of the world's dirty work has to be carried out in the Southern District of New York. No, like every country has some kind of major scandal going on, and then it doesn't actually follow up on it itself, and instead kind of someone has to find some way that it involves the US, and then it ends up on formerly Preet Bharara's desk, and he has to clean it up, which doesn't seem like the most sustainable legal architecture for the world. But anyway, so yeah, as I said, this is kind of also a problem for us in how do we work, right? So when we get this data, right, we need to process it, and that's kind of the part that you were talking about, it, right? In the sense that we need to kind of do the technical work of making data that comes accessible to reporters. But then also, I think much more important is kind of the following steps of finding links that link this data and link the information that's in a leak to kind of a bigger narrative and to a context that it really needs to be looked at in. And I also want to very briefly mention, obviously, kind of the security aspect of this. There's basically the big problem we have is that we're working with people who are in 40 different countries. They're all facing extremely different situations. None of them are particularly great. I think we're going to have a fantastic panel tomorrow afternoon with Pelin, who's somewhere here, and Khadija Ismailova, talking about the human cost that this is taking if it goes wrong, and basically in many cases it's a question of when, not if, on whether this is going to go wrong, and so security obviously is a massive concern with all of this. But looking at technology-wise, one of the things that OCCRP has been trying to do over the last 3 or 4 years is basically to develop tooling that would allow us to kind of handle leaks not as a kind of magic kind of Christmas event, but as a continuous process almost, right? Looking at them as a thing that is happening every week, every month. And so we've started working on this thing called the Aleph project, which basically creates a data management system, and the idea is to bring together data from different sources, not only from leaked data sources, but also from public records and from company databases, from procurement databases, so that basically we don't only have the raw stuff that comes out, but we also have the necessary context, and of course we have the ability to connect this between these two things. And a big goal for us in this is kind of open source development, right? Because doing this is extremely expensive. There's very few news organizations that really want to invest the resource to do software development. We have to, because otherwise we couldn't deal with the influx of material that's coming. But really we're hoping to build kind of more and more of a community around this. So the software that we've made is being it's been released as an open source package. It has a developer community around it. And if anyone here is interested in hacking on something good, then come hang out, and we will find interesting things for you to do. Going beyond the fun open source bit, though, there's still this issue of kind of leaks, treating them as puzzle pieces, right? Because I think there's a real risk of a leak becoming kind of this fetish object, right? And on the other hand, kind of also underappreciating them. So one of the things that we've been importing into our database is a data set that's kind of known as CasaWord. This was released in 2014, and almost like clockwork, every month a reporter goes to our site, looks up some name, and finds a reference to that person, to that politician in CasaWord, right? And I think the risk that we have often is that someone would use a leak for 2 weeks, read some of the emails in there. Because it's so much, we can't actually read all of it. And so kind of do 3 good stories and then put it aside and forget about it. And instead, what we need to do is we need to look at these as kind of resources that are long-term resources that we can piece together more and more using public records and other kind of augmentative information into a puzzle of this offshore industry, right? So basically, I'm looking at this as a countering technique to the fragmentation that really underlies this idea of offshore finance, right? So if people are trying to make it more and more complex by putting different bits and pieces in different places, then one of the ways that we can counter it is by really making sure that it's easy to look in many of these places in one go and find as many references to a particular person or company from these places. And so, yeah, what we've done is we've basically built a massive data archive. We've got somewhere around 30 million documents that includes emails and images and whatever. And we've also put in a ton of kind of databases. So whenever there's like a data set leaked that includes, I don't know, a procurement database that comes out as open data, or a census that gets stolen or sold on the black market to someone and then ends up on BitTorrent. That's the kind of stuff that we're really trying to piece together. It's a resource, some of it we make available to the general public, but much of it is also, we feel sensitive, because it is ugly information. It's not information that I'm super excited to kind of keep. It's information that we need to have in order to piece stuff together, but it is also radioactive in the sense that it contains a lot of really sensitive information about a lot of private and even innocent individuals, right? Because there's no way for us to kind of figure out who has committed crimes without looking at a broader picture of what is the overall economic activity that's going on. Yeah, but then obviously there's the challenges, and I think you've done a really good kind of review of all the ways that this can go wrong. Processing information can end you up in a situation in your life where you don't want to be. Maybe a quick detour. I mean, there was a news item this morning indicating that Assange might be transferred from Ecuadorian embassy to basically British prison at some point relatively soon, right? And that, I think, creates a very awkward moment for us, right? Because on the one hand, the man really hasn't endeared himself to anyone recently. On the other hand, the Cablegate and the Iraq war logs were some invaluable reporting, right? And if, on the basis of what he and WikiLeaks more broadly did, what they did, he can be put in jail in the U.S. Then it presents a more general problem for the freedom of the press in the United States and I guess globally. So we're going to be in a really awkward spot there, apparently quite soon. And in general, I think that kind of leads us to think more about what are the things that we can do when we deal with leaked information that mitigate the risk of someone ending up in an embassy for 7 years in basically custody. And I think one part of that is not letting ourselves be too driven by leaks, right? There's information coming out all the time now, and it's almost hard for us to follow what information is there. And really kind of the thing that a journalist needs to look for is what is a great story. And if there's a great story and there's a leak, that's great. If there's a great story and there's no leak, that's fantastic too. If there's a great leak but no good story, then that's really kind of almost a psyop attack on a journalist, right? Because the value of leaks in themselves in our industry has been put quite high, and so there's a temptation in some cases to do the leak even if there's no story, right? And that's something that we really need to avoid. The other thing is that leaks are obviously weapons, and I don't still have time. I feel like this is something that has happened much less in kind of the European, US kind of hemisphere than it has happened apparently in Central and Eastern Europe, where really at some point everybody is getting hacked. And I even feel there's a slight kind of cultural communication issue around what happened with the 2016 election, where I think what happened was meant to be more of a, I don't know, I'm speaking very widely here, but was much more common in a Russian context or in an Eastern European context than it is in an American context, and so maybe it was meant more as a joke by the Russians than anything else. But really kind of looking at leaks as weapons and saying, hey, someone is trying to harm someone. I'm the weapon in this. I the reporter who receives this information, am given this information in order to inflict damage on this. I think is super important in thinking about what can we do to mitigate that, right? Really, our mission is to tell the truth, right? So not saying anything is not the right answer, but informing people about the context of what might have happened there as much as possible is crucial. And maybe even looking the other way every now and then, and figuring out what is the agenda of the individual that's given me that leak. Another problem that another problem that I really see is kind of what happens when we run out of reporter attention. Again, there's so much data that's showing up that I think there's a real risk that reporters are just getting tired, that there's just not the energy to look through another 5,000 emails. I was in a meeting not too long ago where a reporter confessed to having read 800,000 documents, or at least having reviewed in some form 800,000 documents in 4 weeks. I don't know, that means you definitely have no social life, you definitely have no activity outside of that going on, and I don't know how often you can do that. And then there's also like a weird kind of problem for me as a technologist in this, right? So my origin, as you mentioned, is kind of in the civic technology movement, right? And what we're good at is we're good at looking at kind of problems that are in society that are really hard on a social level, but are easy on a technical level, right? So making an app that will let people report where there's a pothole and then have government go there and fix it. That's kind of our sweet spot, right? Because that's like a nice kind of social problem, but it's really easy to fix on a technology level, right? But keeping 25 terabytes of leaks is actually both a hard societal problem and it is a hard technical problem from a security point of view, but also just from a kind of infrastructure point of view. And that's actually a thing that we're dealing with at this point. It's like how do we actually become more and more of a software company and of a platform operator that can actually do this sustainably and provide basically people that want to look into the offshore industry with the kind of connectivity, with the fullness of a picture that they want to look at. So again, if you have any ability that you want to share with us with regards to design, security reviewing, coding, that's the stuff we really need to figure out the technical end of it. And also if you have another interest, or if you just want to kind of go for a browse and knock yourself out.
Thank you very much. So my plan would be to ask a question to each of you, and then I want to open to the audience, because also if we speak about collective mobilization, I think they have to ask. And so the first question I wanted to ask to Ryan, because I mean from your presentation we really understood how much you care about the openness and also the right of protection for the whistleblowers will and the possibility for the people to access certain data. So since you work at the Intercept, I wanted to ask you something related to the Snowden archive, because we just read recently that there was the decision from the Intercept to shut down access to the Snowden archive and also to eliminate the trusted research team that is taking care of the security for it. So, I mean, we also read about the concern of Laura Poitras about that. I mean, of course, you cannot speak for your own organization, but I want to know your perspective about this. I mean, how is possible to go on then? What is happening to the Snowden archive? Is going to be transferred somewhere else? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that. Personally, I had no involvement in that decision. I wish that decision hadn't been made. I think that we should still have that as a resource in New York, where it was based. But when I started at when I got involved with working with Intercept, it was back in early 2014, and we actually didn't have any of the documents in America. There was too many fears legally about, at that time, the government trying to potentially stop us working in the US. So I was actually working in Brazil with Glenn Greenwald, and I couldn't work in England either because there was a legal risk there, and the lawyers said you can't work there, they might try and put you in jail, so I had to end up going to Brazil. But the point I'm trying to make is we were working with the documents outside of the US. Now they've stopped. They built an extraordinary sort of security infrastructure around the documents. We had like a special secure room that was built to the specification of the US federal government in terms of, they call a SCIF, a secure facility, with like, you know, the metal through the walls and all that, so no signals can get in. It's crazy amount of resources they pumped into building that. So that's not going to be there anymore, because simply what we've been told is that the financial resources, we had a whole team of, we had like a security person, we had an archivist, and we had a couple of researchers as well. And we were, what we've been told is that they simply couldn't, it was either a choice of getting rid of some reporters, or they had to make cuts to the research budget, and they decided that they were going to, they had to get rid of the people who were working around the archive, and as a consequence, because they didn't have the security provisions around it, that we were no longer going to be able to keep it in New York. But from a personal perspective, I certainly still still plan on continuing to do some stories based on that archive. We're having conversations internally about how that's going to work. But yeah, the facility in New York's been shut down. I think it's a really unfortunate decision, and it's not one that I, you know, that I support. I wish that we still had it, but it's just come down in the bottom line to money, and that's often the case. All the other news, like the Guardian, Washington Post, New York Times, they also had copies of the Snowden archive, at least the large parts of it, and they also made the same decision, unfortunately, that they far sooner than we did. I mean, back in like, I think they stopped probably in like 2014, that they couldn't financially justify the resources that went into researching it and continuing to report on it versus the impact they were having on the stories that they were doing. And you know, that's kind of the same calculation that our editors have come to. So.
Yeah, so I would say that this also put us in front of an ethical problem, because, of course, from one side is important to, you know, preserve the security also of the whistleblowers. But then, if we see that Snowden, for example, really wanted certain people to take care of his information, and then the organization decided to close this archive, I mean, it's really a dichotomy, no?
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's a bit of a contradiction there, but what I would say is that the chapter on that hasn't really closed yet. I mean, I think there's a lot to be worked out. There was a lot of internal politics going on inside our organization about it, and I think that, you know, I think that it's unresolved, and that they're talking about furnishing a third party, like a research institute or something, with the documents. But I expect that probably I don't think that it's the case that it's just going to be shut down and no one ever again is going to like do stories or be able to research it. That's just not what's going to happen. But we've reached this sort of fork in the road at the moment, and you know, so I think something will get figured out though in the long term.
Then I have a question for Friedrich, because I was trying to read also a bit more the technical aspect of Aleph, and I was reading that is an open source project, as you say, that was indexing a large amount of data. But then I also read that to access a certain information, you also need to sign to OCCRP data, because there could be some data that might help identifying sources. So in a sense, I also feel, how do you guarantee this aspect of being open source? I mean, how do you decide who get access to the data? Because I understand also from your perspective it's important that there is a sort of collective engagement. But how do you solve this kind of dichotomy among the fact that you also deal with really sensitive data that sometimes cannot be, just put online, and the fact that you want to keep it open source? And then just, a bit more general question, I'm curious about your perspective. If you think there is a way to open up also part of the leaks related to the Panama Papers, the Snowden archive, and the Troika laundromats to the public, and if yes, how could be done? For example, if you consider, that of course you have to anonymize certain data, they cannot just put right out, but still, I think there is the necessity also for the public to be informed about what are these data, and we saw also the difficulty of, going on reporting about that if certain research units are shut down.
Okay, that's a lot of stuff, and I apparently have 2 minutes to answer it. So minute one. Yes, so we were trying to do open source technology, and we're trying to do open data as much as we can. Obviously, there is stuff that we have on trust from sources, and we cannot show to other people. So I'm actually one of the few people who've read the Snowden documents in some degree as inspirational reading, because it's quite interesting to see how an intelligence organization like the NSA kind of compartmentalizes data. So what we've started doing is we're basically assigning code names to investigative projects. They don't have as cool sounding names as the NSA does, but basically then if you are given that code word clearance, you get to see the data that is on some kind of understanding of privacy or basically related to a particular investigative effort. And so we're trying to kind of build a thing that is both public, extremely public, and also extremely restrictive. And we also have to look at this to some extent from the point of data privacy, but more than that, kind of source confidentiality. The other thing is, I think the second point was...
how you think is possible to open part of the leaks of the Panama Papers, Snowden archive?
I think, yeah, I mean, we want to make as much open as possible, and I think kind of both what we've been doing with the previous laundromats, where we released kind of a summarized version of the financial transactions, or at least the amounts given to particular companies, and what has happened with the Panama Papers, where they have released basically a structured database that anyone can access on the ICIJ's website, I think is kind of a good model, right? We're giving access to information that is the real information, that is kind of information that has been useful to our own reporters, but that also lacks certain kind of identifying criteria. I think in general there's a bit of a cult around kind of source documents, because you put out this document that has like a big stamp on it and the letterhead of some Russian Federation eagle, right? And it's all kind of very impressive looking. And I think we're kind of in love with these things. I don't know what the math is on that, because there is a real risk of them containing some sneaky bit of printer magic or whatever it is that really kind of ends up really destroying our trust as reporters. But at the same, and so on the other hand, everybody has a copy of Photoshop, right? So putting a Russian eagle on a thing doesn't require being the Russian government, right? So maybe also as a kind of public of these things, we need to get over this cult of wanting to look at the one that has the stamp on it and has the signature on it and is like a bad fax from 1972. And can agree to live with the fact that maybe what we need is just to be given good information that kind of consolidates the story that a reporter has fully solidified with evidence. I don't know, you grabbed the microphone as soon as I brought up the printer dots.
Then I remembered you only had 2 minutes, and I thought, no, I don't have the time. No, I was just going to say, yeah, I totally agree with that. And also, like on the series we've done on Google, for example, on the Dragonfly, the China search engine thing, we got documents on that, and the source actually has requested that we not publish them because publishing the documents can lead a person to help the authorities or the company or whoever it is identify a person. And also in the case of Snowden, you mentioned, should it be opened up all to the public? I mean, hypothetically, it sounds like a great idea, but, well, first of all, Snowden didn't want that to happen. He gave all those documents. He said there's stuff in there that you shouldn't publish, but that is purely context, so you can understand. And he didn't want it all published. And also, we get a lot. I mean, there's so many people who give us shit for not publishing more documents or not publishing all the documents or not just like dumping it on the internet for everyone to read. But those people, it always dumbfounds me that those people can take that position without having actually seen what's in there. You can't make a rational judgment on whether something should be published if you've not even seen it. And if you are trying to make that judgment, then you're a reckless person because, frankly, there is stuff in there that shouldn't be published, and that's the reason why, you know, dozens of some of the best journalists in the world have looked at it and said, you know, no, that should stay where it is, and we shouldn't report that. So, I mean, but it's a very, you know, there's arguments that can be had, and I would always usually come down on publishing more rather than less. But I do totally also agree with you that there is a kind of fetishization of just publishing documents. And in some cases, we, again, the people who tell us, oh, publish more documents, publish more source documents, when we do that, I mean, we were publishing batches, hundreds of documents at a time from NSA, a series called the SID Today Project. And what we were finding was that all those people who are constantly criticizing us for not publishing enough, they had never have anything to say about the hundreds of documents when we do publish them. They never analyze them, they never discuss them, they never share them. So what the hell are these people doing? They're just like criticizing for the sake of criticizing, in my opinion. And you're always going to get those people in every story you do. They're never happy. So, you know, I don't think they should be listened to.
Okay, so I think this is the right time to open to the public. So, questions? Yes, over there are 2 hands.
Hi. I was wondering what's your experience and your opinion on cooperation with public authorities such as public prosecutors? I mean, do you ever like file reports, come across something and pass on the information?
We rely on public prosecutors as part of our audience. The German federal police recently announced that they seized, I think, 50 million euros worth of property, mainly in Berlin and in Munich, based on the Russian laundromat investigation that we did 3 years ago. It's hard to remember now. They are using this stuff even if we don't cooperate with them. If they want to give us information, on the other hand, my email address was on the board. I'm also available later.
I would just ask if people speak in the public to use the microphone. But I would say there is a second question.
2 short questions again. One is, do you already use blockchain technology for like sharing data or like storing data, or do you think are you considering it? Do you think it could be like anyhow useful? Second question: how does the GDPR affect your work?
That's to both of us or to me. The blockchain question. Honestly, I can answer it. I don't know. We have technologists who work with us, and part of the job they're actually doing is what Fred touched on. They're also trying to develop some open source tools, and I'm sure they've looked into or considered that. And I wish they were here so they could answer your question, because I'm not a good person to answer it. But the GDPR, no, it's not personally affected my work at all. At least not that I know of.
You want to?
On the blockchain, I think no. We do have a censorship problem, but I think there are other ways that do not destroy the planet that can also help us circumvent censorship. Given the choice between a blockchain and an FM radio, I'm going to pick the FM radio. With regards to GDPR, yes, I think for us that is a concern. We hold a lot of personal information. There are exemptions in GDPR, Article 85, 86, that kind of exempt journalistic activity from that, but that puts a burden on us to also then perform professional journalistic tasks rather than messing around.
There is somebody over there. There? There was a hand several times and now it disappeared. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Hi. I was wondering during the, like in general, but also especially during the Raiffeisen suggestion where the stocks apparently dropped at a point. I was wondering, one, if that does anything or if that like just means that like money is like shifted elsewhere. You know, like is that just like a drop in the ocean? And then I was wondering, like on the bigger scale, so to speak, I was wondering that in the last panel through the term corruption. I'm going to do it through that because I think it's easier. Like if I was wondering, like if certain ways of getting around legislation and of like shifting money around, et cetera, so deeply involved in the ways in which states work and in which like civil society works, et cetera. What does it mean in that context to like use the means of civil society that you are apparently using? Like, what are you like? I would think if you are if you make the question evil, you would think isn't that just reiterating the running ideology that if we are a stronger civil society, we could change the system, and if we stand in for more transparency, everything is going to change, et cetera, which is actually just covering the underlying mechanisms, question mark.
But who do you want to do this question? Just to...
This is a question, this
Friedrich
is an open
or
question.
Ryan? Both of them.
This is an open question for discussion.
Mm-hmm.
With regards to the Raiffeisen thing, basically I think we're putting risk into banking, and that's probably a good thing, right? If you are a bank in Europe right now, and you are still facilitating this stuff, the fact that now every year, 3 years running, we've been able to kind of unveil a multi-billion-dollar money laundering scheme is putting the fear of God into you, I hope. The evidence I have for that is Danske Bank, basically. So we started off, we weren't the only ones reporting on this, but basically we got bank records that indicated a $3 billion money laundering scheme that was used by the government of by someone in Azerbaijan to bribe European politicians and other things. Then an internal investigation at Danske Bank has now upped the number to somewhere around 200 billion euros that they suspect they might have laundered in terms of dirty cash. And at this point, it's a real likelihood that they just get unwound. This is also not entirely out of the possibility on Swedbank. Deutsche Bank is a candidate for being unwound in that way if anyone were to find banking records that on in my inbox. So basically, if you kill 3-4 banks, I think the other ones are going to behave. With regards to the civil society question, I didn't fully understand it, but there's like a really interesting phenomenon where civil society has actually moved into offshore, and that's basically liberation movements. So you have a lot of movements in mostly Southern Africa that started off as oppositional forces, and because they weren't allowed in their own countries, they had to kind of set up offshore financial structures. Now they are in power, and some of them have kind of kept the offshore financial structures and are now using it to remove some of the proceeds. That's a really interesting outcome, I feel, in terms of, yeah, good intentions going awry.
Ryan? Maybe I want to connect to the question related to the discourse of the civil society, because by going back to the previous question, I mean, I also understand that it's easy to say, let's open everything, let's publish everything. But still, I think it's important also to discuss together on the discourse of collective mobilization, because as you were also saying, now we are drawn by data, you know, there are so many leaks and so many data to analyze. And at the same time, I also feel that in general, for example, here in Berlin, if we think about the time around 2013, there was really a strong civic engagement, you know, after the Snowden leaks, for Chelsea Manning and so on. And I feel that, you know, a bit of that passion is gone. And at the same time, there are still people paying. I mean, Snowden is still in Russia, Chelsea Manning is back in prison. And, but still, how is still possible to have the interest of the people to care about this subject? Also because, as you say, now the leaks are getting so huge that then, you know, they all float on organizations like yours that you have to do a lot of work. But how can you also engage, you know, interest from the civil society to help also your work?
Well, I think that a big part of it, a lot of it, I think especially in the area of, I was going to talk about it in my little presentation earlier, but the document dumps, ones that don't come directly to a journalist. We're seeing more and more of these cases of a hacker or someone who's just actually taken it upon themselves to publish gigabytes of data on the internet. So they've not even bothered to go to the journalist. They've just dumped it all there for everyone in the world to download. There's a real role for the public, like, you know, you call them citizen journalists or whoever are researchers in those cases, because there is no news organization involved. You can go and actually research those documents. And what you found during did you remember the case with the Sony emails that got hacked and they were all dumped on the internet? And then there was a couple of cases of surveillance companies called Hacking Team and Gamma Group, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, who were hacked by a sort of politically motivated hacker, and all those documents were dumped online. We were getting great tips from the public about those documents where people had dug into them themselves and sending tips and resulted in some good stories, actually. So that's a role, and you don't need anyone's approval to go and do it. You can just go and do it yourself. I also think there's a real absence of an organization. With the example of the Sony emails, it fascinated me that what you tend to find is when there's one of these document dumps, it creates a lot of noise for like a few days or maybe a week or two, but then it just goes away and people kind of forget about it. And that happened with those Sony emails. It was a huge scandal at the time. It was making headlines all across the world, and then people forgot about it, but there was still like tens of thousands of emails there that people hadn't looked at. And then what happened was WikiLeaks went and took it upon itself to go and to index those emails and make put it into, so you could just go and search it almost like a Google specifically for these emails and these Sony emails. And then as soon as WikiLeaks done that, there was another round of stories by a lot of established news organizations. And what that tells you is that those news organizations themselves had not sufficiently researched and archived and indexed and made searchable those documents. They actually waited and relied on someone else to do it. And so I think there's still that was a real public service that WikiLeaks did actually when it done that. And I think there's a real, I would love it if there was an organization was funded solely to try to make accessible some of these dumps that are already just out there in the public domain, because you know, it would just help reporters and also ordinary or people in any walk of life, academics, researchers, just ordinary citizens to actually make use of those archives of information.
We're trying our very best to do that.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Other questions? I can, yes, over there.
So Ryan mentioned that you talked with some journalists and they were saying that there were certain parts of the leaks that should not be published. I would be curious to know, like, what was the arguments for publishing? Can you provide any details? Like, for example, which type of information should not be made public? Which type of information, and where are the gray zones?
Well, usually we would be talking about when it's harm to life. There are cases, especially when you're dealing with like top secret documents, where there might be names of people who've been informants. There might be particular assets of, say, the government or a intelligence agency that is not known publicly, but that is in a conflict zone. Like, let's say, for example, hypothetically, in the middle of Iraq or Syria or somewhere where Islamic State is fighting a war and the US is in there with special forces and all the rest of it. And if you publish that information, there is a risk, not a certainty, but a risk that people might be harmed, people might die. And so those are really the decisions you're making. So when it comes to that, when there's even, for me, when there's even a 5%, a 1%, a 2% risk that somebody could be harmed as a result of what you're doing, physically harmed, and when also usually in any leak of information that you have and that you're going to publish, you always go to the people and you say, look, we're going to do this, do you have any comment on that? And sometimes they will come back to you and they'll know context that you don't know about a particular person or a particular thing, and they will make serious statements to you that a case to you that people could be harmed as a result of it. Those are the sorts of examples where we would come down on the side of redaction. But you know, there are many complicated decisions that you have to make through. It's often there's a lot of debate and discussion, and there'll be multiple reporters and editors involved in it. But the ones where we're doing most of the redactions, it's when it's just really about physical harm. Sometimes also actually with NSA documents, there's a privacy issue, because you could actually be disclosing confidential emails of a person that they've intercepted, and that person is being accused of doing X, Y, and Z, and if you reveal that, it would be defamatory towards that person and also a violation of their privacy, and so you wouldn't want to do that. We actually had a case where we did publish a person's emails that had been intercepted by NSA, a guy in New Zealand, and he consented to that. We actually went to him and we discussed it with him, and it was a crazy case, and he'd been actually wrongly targeted using the PRISM surveillance system. But yeah, generally speaking, we would try to avoid unnecessary violations of people's rights through publication of private information about them.
We have time for a couple of questions. One there.
Yes, I just wanted to ask if you could tell me how would you empower whistleblowers to avoid what Ryan talked about, this whole profiling, logging system, so kind of the step before secure dropping, sending stuff to organizations like yours. Do you touch on that? Like, do you know of any initiative or tools or something?
Well, I think the best thing we do have at the moment is secure drop. I mean, that when I was talking earlier about the first contact problem, that is intended to try and eliminate that, because the first step that the person will be taking is that to contact you will be that they'll be going on. They have to download a Tor browser and then go, and that protects their anonymity because it hides their IP address, and then they can send a message which is encrypted, and then so there's no connection. And we've actually found that to be really quite effective. I mean, we've had some very big stories, some of them that have triggered investigations in the United States by federal agencies. And they've not been able to identify our sources. So it is an effective system if used correctly. But you know, it isn't foolproof either. And like I said also before, sometimes people aren't necessarily, they don't have the knowledge. They don't know that that's the first point of contact. So they might just send an email, a normal email, and you know that can create problems. But yeah, we're always trying to encourage people, and we have a lot of information on our website about what is the best first step to contact and how to do it in a secure way. So, but yeah, I mean, we're always looking for people to come up with new ideas, and so probably someone down the line will maybe invent something that's even better, but secure drop's certainly the best we have currently.
And you?
I also see a lot of charm in kind of low-tech solutions, right? Like anything where you as a human can conceptualize in your mind what are the things that could go wrong is obviously better than using like technology where none of us understand anything about what is going to go wrong until it's already happened. Recently there was a case that really frightened me where a employee of FinCEN, the American Financial Intelligence Organization, was fired because they had intercepted that she was using signal from her workplace, and they correlated it to a leak. So that kind of stuff is already getting weird. So yeah, I think the difficult thing is how do you communicate with people before they do something wrong? I've literally received emails from government email addresses asking how do I leak information to you, to which then the response has to be never talk to a reporter again if you want to keep your job, right? Or like yeah, I wish we had a conundrum, had a solution for this conundrum of how to kind of, yeah, get that information to people more effectively before they've already made decisions that are really hard to unwind later. I think a lot of our reporting is based on very kind of low tech outcomes.
So the last question. Nobody? Okay. Then, I think if there are no other questions, I would just, first of all, like to thank you for this great panel. And then I want to tell everybody to come in 15 minutes because we will have the screening of the Panama Papers. And also, since we will have the film that will be introduced by Lieke, I just want to mention what will happen tomorrow. So just remember to come back because we will start at 3:30 with the artistic talk of RYBN, The Great Offshore. Then we have the Panama Papers keynote with Friedrich Obermeier, moderated by Max Haywood from Transparency International. And then a really important panel that is, I would say, also follow up from what we discussed today, that is about the consequence of whistleblowing, truth-telling, and also reporting in the field of anti-corruption and offshore. And we will have with us really great and brave people that I'm so honored to have here. Peline Unker, Stephanie Gibault, then we will have Khadija Ismaniova from Azerbaijan that will speak on video because she is not allowed to be here, unfortunately. And we will also start the panel by mentioning the case, the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia. And this panel will be moderated by Michael Hormey of Transparency International. So please come back also tomorrow and stay here for the screening of the film. And we are also really proud because it's the German premiere. So come back in 15 minutes. And again, thank you so much for this panel.